I don't believe in the supernatural. Never have, never will. But with everything that's happened over the last few days, I'm questioning everything. I haven't slept. I haven't eaten. I haven't left my house. Yet, I fear she will get to me anyway. Let me start at the beginning. I was driving home from a friend's party 3 days ago. I'd stayed late, and it was already dark out. And then something caught my eye. On the 3rd floor of an old Victorian house, the light was on. In the window, I saw a shape. The shape of a woman hanging upside down, as if her feet were somehow tied to the ceiling, and she was hanging upside down in midair. Her arms somehow hung naturally at her sides, defying gravity, but her hair hung straight down from her head, ending in little wispy threads. No detail, just a silhouette. As soon as I recognized it, I was already past the house, so I turned around and drove past it again. This time, I only saw some rumpled curtains with tassels and a lamp in the window, which, maybe if you squinted real hard, could look like a woman hanging upside down. I shook my head and kept driving home. I'd had a lot of pareidolia jump scares like this. Pareidolia is our brain's tendency to see faces and shapes in randomness, like how we see clouds that look like animals, or knots of wood that look like faces. Sometimes, I think I have an overactive sense of pareidolia. For example, years ago, when I got my bangs cut for the first time, I started seeing shadow people. It took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that the shadow people was just my hair falling into my eyes, that my brain was interpreting as some sort of demon or spirit, so I didn't give the upside-down woman much thought until I saw her again. I was on the subway into work. Lights caught my eyes out the window as another subway passed us in the opposite direction. I looked up, and there she was, the silhouette of a woman hanging upside down in the passing subway car, pressed against the window, blurred by the speed of the train. I only saw her for a split second, and then she was gone as the train rattled past us. What the fuck? I must have just seen like a black jacket draped over a seat or something, right? My heart began to pound. I stared out of the window for the rest of my commute, but all of the other passing subways were fine, filled with commuters staring at their phones. When I got out at the station, my legs were so weak I thought I might collapse, but I forced myself to work. I didn't see anything strange on the way back from work either. When I got home, I tried to distract myself, binging the nastiest stuff on HBO and plowing through an entire bag of chips. Then, I finally went to sleep, only to wake up at 3:03 a.m. I was covered in a film of cold sweat. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't remember any dream. Usually when I woke up like this, the vestiges of some nightmare were still in my head. This time, there was nothing. I rolled over, pulling the covers up to my chin, and closed my eyes. Wait, there was something in the darkness of my room that didn't quite look right. I opened my eyes and looked around the room, my heart hammering. The dark shapes of my nightstand, my bookshelves, they both came into focus. Everything was where it should be, except for the light. It was too dark in here. I rolled back over towards my window and realized that the usual annoying light from the street lamp below was not shining through the curtains. I got out of bed, slowly, and made my way to the window. I pulled back the curtains. My knees buckled underneath me. She was hanging from the roof. Her feet were tied to the awning of the roof, right in front of my window. Her arms hung loosely from her shoulders. Her hair hung straight down, waving gently in the breeze. Actually, her entire body was waving gently in the breeze. I grabbed the curtains and pulled them shut. I ran over to the light. Then I tiptoed back to the window and peeked out a tiny slit between the curtains. No, She was gone. I saw the street lamp, the night sky dotted with stars. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it was a dream. I'd had a few weird moments in my life, in the twilight between dreaming and wake. Sleep is a weird hallucinogenic continuum, and who was I to say that I hadn't imagined the woman out my window? Deep down, I knew that wasn't true, but it was a pretty little lie. I made my way to my workstation. I didn't look up at passing subway cars. I drank about 3 cups of coffee. Jeff, ever the charmer, told me I looked super tired, and Tina asked me if I was sick. I didn't tell them what happened. They wouldn't believe me. When I got home, I started searching online for what I'd seen. I found myself scouring urban legend forums and even old posts here on nosleep, the kinds of places I only visited briefly when I saw the shadow people, or when I was looking for a laugh. Now, I wasn't laughing. I was desperately searching for an answer to whatever this was. And then, finally, I found it. Someone claimed their friend had seen the upside-down woman and had died 4 days later. Stay away from the windows, they warned. It can only manifest in windows. They also remarked that their friend had first seen the woman through 2 layers of glass, like through a car window into the window of a home, and then, later, through only 1 window. Like it was getting closer. Some sciencey person had replied, asking all kinds of ridiculous questions, like if plastic counts or any transparent material, and they replied, there has to be a pane of glass or glass-like material in front of the person. They didn't explain glass-like any further. There was no way to avoid windows unless I lived in the basement, so I moved food, water, and clothing down there while half closing my eyes. I told my boss I was sick. It took me a long time, but then I was settled in. For how long, I didn't know. I didn't know if it was even possible to wait out the upside-down woman, and I didn't even know if I actually believed in her existence in the first place. That was about to change. I decided to get some reading done to get my mind off things. I grabbed my book, and without thinking, grabbed my reading glasses. As soon as I put them on, I screamed. She was hanging from the basement ceiling, hanging in the corner, a void of darkness, hair nearly trailing to the floor. And then, this time, she moved. In jerky, incredibly fast motions, she broke free from the ceiling and scrambled towards me. I ripped the glasses off my face, but not before pain exploded in my arm. When I looked down, there were 4 deep scratch marks on my forearm, dripping in blood. That leaves me here. I'm sitting in my basement, away from all windows and glass, on the 3rd day. According to the guy on the internet, his friend was killed on the 4th day. I don't know what will happen after 4 days. If that means I've waited her out and she'll move on to another target, or if she'll kill me anyway, glass or not. If you don't hear from me in 24 hours, assume the worst. It was a cold gray day at the theme park when I first met Mr. Peepers, the day when my life would change forever. My job was to take tickets from smiling families as they came through the gates, tearing them in half and giving them a stub. The family of 4 who approached the park entrance that morning looked just like any other normal family, except for the strange man who followed behind them, wearing dark sunglasses and too tall not to be noticed. He was wearing an old-fashioned looking suit and a pork pie hat, the brim of which cast his face in shadow. "Tickets, please," I said, sticking out my hand. After they'd all been checked, I couldn't help but notice they were 1 short. I looked suspiciously at the tall man with sunglasses, as the family waited for me to say something. "You're 1 short," I stated, a little annoyed. It was obvious they needed 5 tickets for 5 people, and yet they pretended like they didn't know that. "What do you mean?" Didn't we give you 4 tickets? The man asked, scowling at me. You trying to rip us off here, buddy? I rolled my eyes and pointed at the tall man with the pork pie hat, who was hanging back and standing behind the little girl. Maybe he wasn't part of the family after all. Isn't he with you? The girl, who I presumed to be the man's daughter, turned around and let out a little squeal of joy. But the rest of the family didn't react much at all, except to look around and look straight through. The man in the sunglasses. Who, him? The father asked, pointing to someone a ways back, still paying for tickets. No, the tall guy with the sunglasses, I said, still not understanding how they were confused. How could they not see the man right in front of us? But then I realized that the tall man with sunglasses was not what I thought he was. He wasn't a person at all, and not everyone could see him, only special people, and he wasn't used to being seen. He pulled down those dark sunglasses, and I saw his eyes were enormous insectile things, with many facets like jewelry. Those eyes looked closely at me, studying me. Oh, that's just Mr. Peepers, the little girl said, giggling. He doesn't need a ticket, he just goes right in. I didn't argue with her. Mr. Peepers could do whatever he liked, as long as it meant getting the fuck away from me. With his big bug eyes and penetrating gaze. Go, I whispered. Please, just go. What? The man asked loudly. I can't hear you when you're whispering, damn it. I managed to find my voice, despite those insectile things boring into my brain, staring at me relentlessly. I said, please, have a nice day at Bigsbyland. My voice said from a million miles away. I felt like I was being drawn into those strange eyes, escaping my body. I was no longer inside my skin, but floating somewhere in between me and Mr. Peepers. Finally, the man exclaimed, and then, a moment later, they were gone, and that horrible thing posing as a man was gone with them. The little girl took a second to turn back and smile at me, waving. Then she ran ahead to catch up with her family. After that moment, my life would never be the same. The vision started right after the family walked away. When I blinked, I noticed the differences immediately. Whenever I closed my eyes, I could see that man, Mr. Peepers, staring at me, like he had implanted himself on the inside of my eyelids. I hated it more than I can ever explain in words. Close your eyes and imagine what I went through, what I am still going through. For just a second, close your eyes and imagine that instead of the soothing darkness you're experiencing, you can only see a horrifying face staring back at you, one with oversized insectile eyes, judging you, scrutinizing you, feasting on the contents of your mind. Something like that would be enough to drive most people to the brink of insanity, and over its black precipice with a howl. But somehow I managed to keep my mind intact, if only in the hopes that I would one day rid myself of him. The visions just got worse though. After a few years, I began to see Mr. Peepers when my eyes were open, as well as closed, but I won't talk about that yet. 5 years after that fateful day at the theme park, I ran into the family again. I had kept my job, but now I worked inside the park, at an arcade where I stayed behind the scenes, resetting malfunctioning machines and cleaning up puke mostly. What can I say? It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. And the park management seemed to have noticed my increasing anxiety and odd behavior, because they had long ago relegated me to work in a position without much face-to-face customer interaction. The young girl was a teenager now, and she was playing a racing game with a friend. It would have been hard for me to miss her. Mr. Peepers was looming just behind her. As soon as I looked at the two of them from across the arcade, both of them turned sharply to stare at me. Not the girl and her friend, but the girl and Mr. Peepers. When he saw me, he lowered his sunglasses again and began to move toward me, closing the distance between us quickly with his long strides, the pants of his old-fashioned suit making a loud swishing noise. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the mop I was holding and ran from there. never looking back. When my boss called later that day, I told her I was quitting, citing medical issues. Something at the park was triggering a deep anxiety within me, and I'd been having panic attacks. That was the closest I could tell her to the truth without sounding ridiculous, and I've never been fond of lying. She offered to let me take an unpaid leave of absence rather than quitting, and I told her I would think about it, but part of me knew I would never return to that place. At least, so I thought. It was 3 a.m. when I got up to use the bathroom in my apartment. The hallway was dark as I padded barefoot towards the washroom on the left. The floorboards creaked loudly with each step I took as I approached the doorway. Feeling anxious of what might be lurking in the dark, I poked my head around the entrance, letting out a sigh when I saw the washroom was empty. Flicking on the light switch, I entered the room, walking on tiptoes. I felt like I needed to be quiet for reasons I couldn't ascertain, as if my movements might wake up a slumbering giant. A noise from the bathroom caused me to turn around rapidly, my heart beating fast. My vision was blocked by the shower curtain. That opaque divide set me off. I had to make sure. My heart was pounding out of my chest as I pulled back the shower curtain, needing to see inside, needing to make sure I was alone. I tore the shower curtain hard to the left, ripping it from 3 of the hooks in the process. Empty. I turned back around, leaving it open. Why had I ever closed it? I didn't even remember doing it. Looking into the mirror, I saw my eyes were red and inflamed, as was the norm lately. I never wanted to blink, since I wanted to avoid seeing that horrible face of Mr. Peepers behind my eyelids. So I kept my eyes wide open as much as possible, splashing water on my face. I tried to ease the burning of that redness. The water was cold and refreshing, and for a few seconds, I managed to forget about Mr. Peepers. I rubbed my face with a towel and hung it back up on the rack. "You're okay," I said aloud, looking at myself in the mirror. "Everything is gonna be fine." And suddenly, without warning, I felt him next to me. The presence of someone very tall and looming, staring at me, was immediately palpable. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned around, and there he was, standing in my bathroom, real as he'd been at the theme park, and he was smiling, his eyes boring into me. I screamed so loud that I thought the mirror would shatter in front of me, but it stayed intact. As my legs started to shake and my bladder released, my gaze turning to darkness as that horrible face stared at me, smiling, arms reaching out and growing longer as they stretched towards me, like shadows of gnarled tree branches growing in the dimness of sunset turning into night, and the world went black as I passed out. My dreams were terrible that night. Although I don't remember them at all, I remember the feeling of them, the sheer horrifying dread in them, and I know that he was responsible for that feeling. He was enjoying making me suffer with fear. When I awoke on my bathroom floor the next morning, Mr. Peepers was standing over me, like a doctor doing his morning rounds. "How are we feeling today?" I imagined him asking, and let out a bout of manic laughter. Mr. Peepers cocked his head at this and removed his sunglasses, looking at me with those big bug eyes. "I'm losing my mind," the thought came to me with a sudden surety. Then he smiled and began to laugh as well, but his laughter didn't sound like laughter. It sounded like shards of glass scraping a ragged tune across a chalkboard. He didn't open his mouth when he smiled or laughed, and this was somehow even more unsettling. His face grew red, and his bug eyes bulged with that laughter, as if trying desperately to keep it inside. "What do you want from me?" I asked, terrified of how he might respond. I thought this thing could kill me at any second, and yet it just stood there, watching me. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. "I've been seeing you every time I close my eyes, ever since that day. Fuck. Why me? Why did you choose me?" Again, he didn't answer. "Is it ever gonna stop?" I thought he wouldn't respond, leaving me with nothing. But then, he slowly shook his head, and that horrible held-in laughter came again. That head shake could only mean one thing. No, this was never going to end. I was stuck with Mr. Peepers now, whatever he was, and he wasn't leaving anytime soon. For the past 10 years, I've been doing research, trying to figure out what this thing is that's haunting me. I've scoured the internet, dug through dusty tomes and forgotten sections of old libraries, and visited bookstores belonging to witches, occultists, and paranormal enthusiasts. Some of those places made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, and I felt a power similar to what Mr. Peepers emits, but I couldn't find anything about him in any books or online resources. Many of the people working at these places asked me if I was all right, and some even recommended that I go see a doctor. They told me I didn't look well, and they were right, but I knew that no doctor could help me. I didn't bother to tell them that fact. "Thanks," I'd say instead. "I'll do that." Lack of sleep was starting to get to me, and after dealing with this entity for 15 years, I knew I was on the brink of something bad happening. I had walked into traffic unintentionally nearly a dozen times, just in the past few months. I was fired from every odd job I took, each time for being inattentive and not finishing my duties on time. It was like I was in a haze, and worse yet, I began to see more and more strange hallucinations, more creatures like Mr. Peepers. One day, while walking down the street to go to the store, I saw what could only be described as a gremlin, holding the bloody carcass of something in its mouth before turning down a dark alley. I tried to convince myself it was a dog who'd gotten a hold of a rat, but I knew it wasn't. Another time, I found myself staring out the window at something standing in the glow of a streetlight. It seemed like it was staring at me, but after a few minutes, it wandered off. I could have sworn it was ambulating using at least 6 legs. The black silhouettes of insectile mandibles on its face were clearly seen as well, but I told myself I'd imagined those. I could list off 100 different strange things that I saw during this time. As the world around me grew more surreal and dreamlike, deer walking on their hind legs, with red eyes, speaking to each other in dark voices before walking off into the forest, giant spiders being lowered from clouds, tethered to silken strands of webbing, picking off birds and squirrels and wrapping them in webbing before rappelling back up into the sky, mushrooms that grew from my walls and dripped like melted wax onto the floor, before crawling toward me and trying to bite me. I left the apartment for a week after that one, and when I came back, the thing was gone. I had done research on sleep deprivation and knew that hallucinations were one of the symptoms. Same with inattentiveness and headaches, poor judgment, anxiety, depression, slow reaction time. Check, 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 and triple check. If you look at that list, it's pretty obvious why I couldn't work in public, why I had to leave my job at the theme park, and why I couldn't even hold down a position delivering junk mail. But it didn't change the fact that I had to go back there. I knew I had to go back to Bigsbyland. Something was pulling me to that place. For as long as I tried to ignore that pull, I finally had to give in to it. As I approached the ticket taker that morning, I wondered if it would be someone I knew, an old friend I would recognize from the break room. I shouldn't have been worried though. The teenage girl who scanned my ticket, now digital and downloaded directly to my cell phone, barely even looked at me, and I didn't recognize her from my time working there obviously. She would have been a kid back then. I entered the park and looked off into the distance, seeing the trademark artificial mountain made of fiberglass, which stood at the center of Bigsbyland. A long while ago, something terrible had happened inside the tunnels of that place. When I'd been working at this theme park, at least one of the 2 kids had survived, but what had happened to his friend was still a mystery. I shook my head, trying not to think about it. I had my own problems to worry about. Mr. Peepers trudged along beside me, his long legs making it easy for him to keep up. For every 2 steps I took, he took 1 lazy stride. Looking around near the entry, I realized how crazy my plan was. What were the chances of running into her again? And even if I did see the girl, who would now be a full-grown woman, there was no guarantee she could or would want to help me. But still, I had to try. After sitting on a bench near the entrance and watching families come and go for a while, I decided to take a walk around. I could cover more ground that way and hopefully see more faces. I walked along the cobblestone path, trying to ignore Mr. Peepers, and looked instead at the water fountains and pools which stretched for several hundred yards to my right, separating one side of the promenade from the other. Shops and restaurants were to my left, and off in the distance, I could hear the shrill screams of children on the rides. Crashing into the bulk of someone tall and wide, I apologized profusely. I had been so distracted looking at the sights, I hadn't even seen him or his cart. The sweaty man didn't budge, and I felt my jaw ache from the impact of slamming into his back. The sticky sweat which dampened his pale yellow shirt was now clinging to me everywhere, and I wanted nothing more than to take a shower at that moment. It felt slimy and disgusting, and the warmth radiating from him was so intense, I could still feel it from where I stood, several feet away. I backed up even more, sensing something was wrong about this man. He turned around slowly, taking his time, and I saw he was holding something in his hands which at first I mistook for a balloon. He pulled and stretched the rubbery thing, then held it up to his face and began to blow into it. I tried to make sense of his features as he inflated the balloon thing with great heaving breaths of air, but each second that passed made the balloon thing bigger, covering his confusing features. He reminded me a bit of a clown, with his face painted white, with red-rimmed eyes and mouth. His hair was likewise red and puffed out to the sides, also giving him a clownish appearance. But that was where the similarities ended. His hands were not hands but sharp talons, like on an eagle, pitch black with long hooked claws. He wore a yellow shirt with red suspenders, and had a huge gut that seemed to move and bulge, as if alive and filled with giant squirming worms. He was blowing up that thing that looked like a balloon, but wasn't, and I managed to shift my focus for a second to see more clearly what it was. Despite looking closely at it, I still wasn't sure. It was like the skinned carcass of some deceased creature that didn't exist in our world, something between a giant rat and a possum, and as it expanded past its capacity, it exploded, spraying me with entrails and sticky warm blood. I closed my eyes and screamed. The sound erupted from me like an explosion, and I felt eyes turning to look at me from all around. I heard the gasps and shocked cries from families, people who were just visiting the park to have a fun, wholesome day, and were now subjected to the sight of me covered in blood and guts. But there was no blood and guts, no clown creature blowing up horrifying balloon animals. Just me, standing there, after screaming my head off in the middle of a brightly lit theme park. "What's wrong with him?" someone asked. It sounded like a snobbish woman. "Mental problems," someone else answered. Can we just have a normal day for once?" "What the hell?" The voices were rising and intermingling, all accusing, all mocking, teasing, hateful, unforgiving voices. I'll get a manager." "Forget the manager, call the cops. This guy's nuts." And then, with the calm, steady voice, came another. "He's with me. It's okay. I'll take care of it." A warm hand grasped mine and pulled me from the crowd as I closed my eyes and pretended I was anywhere else, too ashamed to look at the faces around me for another second. "Keep a closer eye on your patient," someone yelled, and I realized they thought she was my nurse. I could still hear their voices, making fun of me and insulting me, but thankfully, they faded into the distance as we walked away from there. After a while, I realized my eyes were still closed, and I blinked them open, afraid of what I might find here, In the real world, the girl who was holding my hand was not a girl anymore, but it was her. I was sure of it. I recognized her as surely as I would my own mother. They're awful, I know. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Trust me, I know more than most how bad it can be. Another thought occurred to me then. The clown. He'll kill them. She cut me off with a finger to her lips, shushing me. Quiet. They're safe. He can't hurt you. Unless you let him. She looked to be in her 20s now, and had grown up to be a young woman. She wore all black like a goth, and her nails and lips were painted the same dark shade. It's you, isn't it? The girl from way back then? You saw him too. He was with you. Mr. Peepers, he infected you? She asked simply. I didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't sure what he'd done to me, but I supposed infected was as good a word for it as any. Yeah, I said, and now I'm seeing others too, like that one back there, the clown. I saw him, she said, sitting us down at a table in an outdoor seating area. I've been looking for you, you know? Really? Why? I asked. I would have thought you'd be happy to get rid of him. He's my problem now, right? She sighed. I wish it were that simple, she said, looking up at Mr. Peepers, who was standing just a couple feet away. What do you mean? Do you actually understand what's going on here? She took a long moment to collect her thoughts, then began. Yes, I think I do. It took a long time, but I really think I've started to figure it all out. Well, tell me, please. I'll do anything to get rid of him. Anything. You may never be able to completely rid yourself of him, or any of them, but you can limit your interactions with them. Mr. Peepers was walking closer to her now, hovering over her, looking as if he was trying to intimidate her. See what he's trying to do right now? He's posturing, trying to scare me. The difference between you and I is that I never let him. He was lowering his sunglasses, leaning in closer, until his face was inches away from hers. She turned to face him, then spat in his big bug eyes. I'm not afraid of you, she said, and looked back at me. Did you ever figure out that he was feeding on your fear? That's what his kind does. That's why he left me and went to you. As soon as he realized you could see him, my mind was racing, thinking through all of this. In all the time I'd seen Mr. Peepers, it had never occurred to me that he could be feasting on my emotions, specifically my fear. But it made perfect sense. It was like a symbiotic relationship, or more realistically, a parasitic one. So, what the hell do? I asked. Just act like I'm not scared until he goes away? She laughed humorously. No, it's not enough for you to simply pretend. You need to actually forget your fear of him. It might be difficult, but try to think of him like a joke, a clown. I hate clowns. They freak me out. Sorry, bad example. I just mean, try to be amused by him. Think of him as an annoying younger sibling or something like that. That's what I did. I thought he was my imaginary friend. Or maybe I just convinced myself of that to make it easier. I don't really remember, but either way, it had the same effect. He latched onto you to get away from me, because he felt your fear and he knew he'd starve to death if he stayed with me. I thought about this for a while, then something came back to me. The first time I saw him in my apartment, I passed out, I said. I woke up the next morning to see him standing over me, like a doctor doing his morning rounds. I think I was already losing it a little bit because I started laughing, and I don't think he liked that. He pretended he was laughing too, but it didn't look like he was enjoying it. It looked a little bit like it was hurting him. The woman smiled when I said this last part. Really? That's very interesting. Why? She looked up at Mr. Peepers and laughed in his face. He cringed backwards, ever so slightly. Because that piece of shit pretty much ruined my childhood. So I hope you can keep it up. She stood up and looked about ready to walk away. I jumped to my feet, terrified of losing her wisdom. Wait, that's it? Can't you give me anything else? She stood there looking at me for a few seconds, uncertain, and that's when I read between the lines and began to understand. There was a reason she wanted to leave so quickly. Mr. Peeper scared her a lot more now than he ever did as a child, and she didn't want him latching on to her again. I couldn't blame her. Good luck, she said, and began to walk away. Then, after a few steps, she turned around and looked back. There's not many people out there who can see him, she said. If you want to find someone to take him off your hands, you're gonna need to start looking. I think I got lucky with you. People like us, we're 1 in a million, maybe less. Who knows? It could just be the two of us. And just like that, she was gone. I left the theme park that day with a mission, and for the first time since meeting Mr. Peepers, I had a glimmer of hope. Now I have a weapon to use against him, and something to look forward to, a real chance at getting rid of him. If only I can really start to think of him as a joke, and no longer fear his bug eyes on the back of my eyelids every time I blink. It's harder than it sounds, but I'm trying my best. I'm trying everything I can. I try to genuinely find amusement in his strange features and ridiculous pork pie hat. Anything to make him seem less scary and more funny. With the last of my savings, I'm taking Mr. Peepers on the road. We're going to be traveling all over. I'm going to be staying away from theme parks, since he seems to enjoy basking in all the fear floating around those places, as people ride roller coasters and get sent screaming through the air on various rides. Instead, I'll be going places that are happy and carefree, places with lots of crowds, lots of people, sports stadiums, giant concerts, festivals, and I'll be watching for that one look of recognition in the eyes of a ticket taker, asking if I have a second ticket for the tall gentleman behind me, wearing sunglasses. A couple of years ago, I was dating a woman named Lynn. She was deeply enthusiastic about alternative medicine. It was such a strange obsession. In every other aspect, she was insightful and critical. Hell, she was a paralegal. She just had this one blind spot that I could never figure out, and it was a big part of her life. We were together for 2 years. During that time, she had me try all kinds of strange treatments and experiences. Things like acupuncture, spiritual healing, crystals, Reiki, rolfing, and even a seance. I may or may not have been asked to do ayahuasca. I went along with it because I cared deeply for her, but the cracks in our relationship had started to show. Turned out we wouldn't last in the long run. But I don't want to talk about that relationship. I want to talk about this one treatment she took me to, and how it has shaped the life I'm living today. It's a bit complicated. I'm going to talk about step-minding. It was an early Minnesota morning, and the last session that Lynn and I would attend as a couple. We pulled into a nondescript parking lot, and Lynn led me by the hand. We'd had an insane fight that morning about something I can barely even remember. I think it was the order you put in yogurt when eating muesli. Of course you put the muesli in first, right? It's like cereal. We entered a stale waiting room. The AC must have been off for days. I could taste the air. The only other person there was a short, balding man who spoke to us in a vaguely European accent, barely looking up from his iPad. "Stevenson's?" he asked. "Overexposure is room 4. "No, that's not us," I said. "We're..." Right, sorry," he sighed. "Wrong day." He tapped the screen a couple of times and nodded. "Step-minding, couples treatment? Still, room 4. "Thank you." He wandered off, and I noticed he didn't have any shoes on. I pointed it out to Lynn, who elbowed me. She thought I was being judgmental. I just thought it was strange. I didn't want to start anything. She vehemently disagreed with my assessment. As always, we walked up to room 4. The door was already open. It was a plain windowless room with a small coffee table, surrounded by 4 basic office chairs. There was a vase with a single blue sunflower. There was a naked light bulb overhead with nothing covering it. The floor was covered in plain gray carpet. There was a little note on the door that urged us to take off our shoes. Lynn just smiled at me, as if this explained everything. I rolled my eyes. We sat down across from one another and waited. It didn't take that long before a woman wandered in. She was in her 40s, wearing a sort of knitted white wool caftan. She had a combed-back flat Elvira-looking hairdo, and covered herself in rings, chains, and bangles. She shook our hands, smiling widely. "I'm Dr. Bogan," she assured us. "But please, call me Jane." I wasn't feeling all too confident about what we were about to do. Jane described the procedure. Stepminding was a way to connect to one another in a new way, giving a better understanding of what it's like to walk a mile in their shoes. There were a couple of rules to remember before we started. For example, once the treatment started, we couldn't get up from our chairs. If we did, we'd get horribly nauseous. Also, we had a sort of safety noise. If someone were to snap their fingers 3 times in a sequence, that would trigger a failsafe that brought us right back. All in all, it seemed odd, but not like nefarious. Then we began. Jane rhythmically snapped her fingers, like someone tapping their feet to a slow song. She spoke in a monotone voice, asking us to look down. "Look at your feet," she said. "Imagine the feeling of walking, the way your muscles contract and your knee bends. Think of how it makes you feel, and imagine the sound you would think your body makes." I don't remember the exact wording of what she told us next, but I remember how it made me feel. Without moving, we were supposed to imagine standing up, stepping across and through the coffee table, and sitting down in the chair of the person on the other side, our spirit passing through them, occupying the same space. We were to imagine looking at ourselves through the eyes of the other. There was a breathing exercise, followed by the rhythm of her finger snapping. We joined our breaths, and Jane made us focus on each part of our body, leading from our toes up to the top of our heads. She called it materializing. We kept our eyes on our feet, except slowly, weren't my feet anymore. "Now look," Jane said. "Look at yourself." I was looking down at Lynn's feet, but not through my eyes. I have a hard time describing the first sensation of stepminding. Jane's finger snapping stopped, and all of a sudden, I was looking up at, well, myself. I was sitting in Lynn's chair. I was, for all intents and purposes, experiencing the world as Lynn. I was Lynn. My hands were smaller, more delicate. I was colder, and my clothes were uncomfortable. Smell and taste felt different, and I had this gnawing hunger in the back of my stomach. My back ached, and I could feel my long hair reaching halfway down my back. I wasn't just looking at Lynn's feet. I was Lynn. I can barely remember what I did. We talked and touched each other's hands, reassuring one another that we were actually experiencing this. Lynn was repeating the same things over and over. "That's me," she said. "And I'm looking at me. You're me. I'm you." We had a long discussion. I could feel air reverberating through my throat in a strange way. I spoke with Lynn's voice, and it made my neck strain. I had to settle myself in her body, and there were so many details that just didn't click. It was so hard to focus on what was being said, when all I could think about was the way my earrings swung back and forth when I moved my head. But after about an hour, Jane snapped her fingers 3 times, and I was back in my chair in the blink of an eye. This is how I realized I was short-sighted. Lynn's vision had been perfect. I also felt bigger, heavier. Her world felt so different from mine, and while it didn't explain our disagreements, It gave me some insights into just how different we really were. I made a note to get new glasses. Still reeling from the experience, Lynn and I thanked Dr. Bogan and stepped out. We had a strange, disorientated talk in the parking lot and broke up. It was oddly amicable, as if we both understood that we were fundamentally incompatible. That was it. No drama. Just, that's it. I thought about that day for weeks. It was so unreal. I mean, how do you go from a literal out-of-body experience and back to work on Monday morning? You can't pretend that nothing happened. I wanted to understand it. Like, really understand it. I'd been to countless nonsensical treatments with Lynn, but this one had been the real deal. There was no denying it, even though I desperately tried to. A couple of weeks later, I returned to Dr. Bogan on my own. I wanted to talk to her about it, the science behind it, how it functioned, how it was performed, anything. And of course, how I had never heard of step-minding before. I met her on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. She sat me down and had her assistant offer me a cup of coffee. She explained it as calmly as she could. It was complicated, but essentially, she explained it as something based on Roskian identity theory, the transfer of thought pattern through vocal meditation, exchanging vibrations, and adapting electrical patterns in the brain. Every word sounded like nonsensical pseudoscience, but it didn't change the fact of what I had experienced. And at the end of the day, that was the only thing that really mattered. I have to see it again, I said. I need to understand this. Funny you should say that. She smiled. I think we can work something out. Jane offered me a quid pro quo. She had a couple of patients who could benefit from a step-minding session, but she needed a neutral third party to act as the recipient. I seemed to be a good fit. I was skeptical, but she had a little bonus to sweeten the deal. She'd pay me a handsome sum of cash for each session, as a kind of consultation fee. I was a bit hesitant, but I agreed. 1 week later, I sat in on a session with Jane and one of her patients. The patient had a dissociative issue and needed a step-minding session to alleviate a strange obsession she seemed to have with what sounded like a houseplant. I didn't pay too much attention. I was nervous. I couldn't figure out why. Maybe it was the thought that what I had experienced was real, and how that would force me to change the way I viewed the world. If a thing like step-minding exists, who's to say there aren't ghosts or even wizards? So I sat down with this stranger, and Jane started snapping her fingers. Now look, she began. Look at yourself. Jane used the same words, the same sequence, the same rhythm, stepping out of my body and into another. But the difference was palpable this time. Lynn had been calm and collected, but this woman was the opposite. Sitting in her body, my pulse was higher, my legs were shaking, and my breathing was shallow. I was physically exhausted, but mentally wired, thoughts rushing 100 different ways at once, and I didn't even know why. A single second in that body, looking across my table back at myself, and I could tell they were a troubled person. I was to sit there for a while, as Jane had a discussion with the other patient. Instinctively, I stood up to leave the room, to give them privacy, but I had to sit back down. My head started spinning as all these unfamiliar muscles reacted to my input, and I couldn't get very far. Perhaps the sitting down rule was there for a good reason. I sat there, trying to calm down, while the two of them had a discussion. I was asked to put my headphones on for a bit, and I didn't mind. It was hard hearing anything through my pounding pulse anyway. As the session came to an end, Jane snapped her fingers, and I was back in my chair. My heart rate was slower. I wasn't shaking. I was nervous, but compared to the other patient, I was an obelisk of relaxation. For a moment, looking across the table, I could see her taking a deep breath. She was still shaking, but not as much as when we started. Perhaps that session gave her a new perspective on things. As the patient left, I got a moment to talk to Jane alone. I explained to her that if we had wheelchairs instead, the other patient could be rolled out during the session. That would be more effective than using headphones. She really liked that idea and suggested we try it at the next session, which, inadvertently, answered my next question. There was going to be more sessions. I worked on and off with Dr. Bogan for a couple of months. I usually did about 3 to 5 sessions per month, netting me a bonus income of about $400 per session. Jane ended up getting 2 wheelchairs and having her assistant Jonathan wheel me out while she had a conversation with the other patient. I grew accustomed to it and started to enjoy the sensation. It's sort of a pleasant ego death. You feel more connected to the world. It was becoming a steady source of secondary income, taking an afternoon off work to get paid for something that I ultimately enjoyed. Yeah, not a bad deal. Over the upcoming weeks, I got a couple more opportunities. I joined Jane on a couple of out-of-town sessions, meeting with some clients she was following up with. Mostly folks who needed privacy for one reason or another. Folks with all kinds of strange afflictions. I could probably write a book about those people alone. Coming back home, Jane contacted me about doing a couple of sessions where she wasn't personally involved. I was also asked to be the guide a couple of times, seeing as how I step-minded so many times and could recite the guiding words by heart. The pay was more than doubled, so I agreed. I had 3 guiding sessions on my own. One with a hippie couple who wanted to experience a sort of intimacy. Let's just leave it at that. Another with 2 brothers, performing a trust exercise. The third one was a group of college kids who wanted to debunk the whole thing, and they left sort of befuddled. All in all, things were going well. Then I got a call about a neutral third party. I was going to perform a switch with a patient, but this time, Jane wasn't involved at all. The customer went straight to me. It was a group of people who contacted me. They described it as their dad having a disorder, and that they wanted to try step-minding to sort of reset him. They'd arranged their own guide, so they just needed me as a neutral third party, someone who wouldn't freak out about the process, as it might take a couple of hours to get through to him. It would be my longest session yet, but the pay was good, and I'd tried a lot of things up until that point. I was ready. I met the client, Harold, at his home in southern St. Cloud. Big place, 3 floors, gated property with both a pool and a tennis court, modern architecture, and heated floor tiles. The guide for the evening was a cheery woman in her 40s. She gave off a bit of a college professor kind of vibe. Apart from the client himself, there was a group of 4 other people who seemed to be close relatives. And of course, there was Harold himself, the man I was supposed to work with. Harold was surprisingly upbeat. I couldn't see anything obviously wrong with him, which surprised me. From what I understood, he was in dire need of this treatment. He was a man in his early 60s but could easily pass for 50. Hell, the man had better teeth than me. I could tell he must have been a salesman at some point. You can tell by his smile. I was introduced to the others, who introduced themselves as friends and family. We hurried into the living room, where a space had been prepared. We were all seated as a group. The guide had prepared everything and offered me a reassuring smile. She took our hands, something that Jane usually didn't do. "I just want to make sure we're all feeling good about this," she said. "We good?" We nodded. "We good," I nodded. "We're good," Harold agreed. And with that, the session was on. The guide snapped her fingers, lowered her voice, and took us down the mental road and across the table. By then, I knew the process. The right words, with the right cadence, at the right time. I sunk back in my chair, looking at my feet, and felt the world shift. After a while, my shoes looked different. They were nicer, and my pants fit me better. Slowly, I started to feel the reality of my borrowed body, the various aches and pains, the thinning hair, the wrinkles on my cheeks when I blinked. I'd aged about 30 years in a couple of minutes, and it would take some time adjusting. Looking up and seeing myself in the opposite chair, I got this anxious sting in my chest. The thought crossed my mind. What if I never returned? The guide excused herself and left. She'd done her job. The rest was up to Harold and his associates. But as soon as I heard the front door close, the air in the room shifted. Harold was sitting there, looking at me, stretching his arms. The others joined us, making a circle. One of Harold's associates, a young woman who introduced herself as Hope, spoke to the both of us. She could easily have been his daughter. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," I nodded. "You do what you gotta do." "So this works?" Harold asked. This is it? It's done?" "It's done," Hope smiled. Harold pulled out a gun, a well-polished revolver. I was the only one who reacted, flinching at the sight of it. The others didn't seem to care. I didn't know what to do. Should I be scared? If so, why was no one reacting? "So we just cut the cord then," he said, "and we're good to go." "Wait, what are you?" They were tricking me. They put me in that old body and had no intention of putting me back. I held up my hand and snapped my fingers 2 times. But before the third snap, I had a gun pushed against the back of my head. "That won't help," Hope said. "We'll just kill you when you're you again." It's hard to describe what I felt in that moment. The fear was real, but there was also a longing to go back. Being out of your body is like sleeping outside. You feel exposed and maladjusted. If you know it's just for a while, it's not that bad. But if there's a chance you can't go back, it becomes terrifying. Like getting lost in the woods. That's not even counting for the primal terror you feel from having a gun pointed at you. Harold seemed a bit confused, which made me realize that no one had explained the rules to him, that we couldn't get up, and that 3 snaps of a finger would cancel the effect. I got the impression that he had thought this was somehow permanent. Looking at him, I could see a worry spread across his face. My face. "You said this was permanent," he said, looking at Hope. "It is, as long as you don't do 3 finger snaps." "How's that gonna work when we cut him off?" "You're gonna have to make sure you're never around someone who snaps their fingers, Harold." She smiled. "That's not too much, is it?" "Do I have to remind you that I got the tapes to put you away?" Harold snarled back. "And that if anything were to happen to me, you're done." "Nothing's gonna happen, Harold," Hope chuckled. "Look, you're right there, safe and sound." She pointed at me. It was as if a light turned on in Harold's eyes. He was being double-crossed, just like me. In a desperate moment, he raised his handgun at me. I recoiled so hard that I fell out of my chair, feeling my heart skip a beat, cold sweat spreading across my arms, clinging to the thinner inner fabric of Harold's expensive blazer. But there was no gunshot, just a click. His gun was empty. That click was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I came crumbling down to the floor, feeling the effects of the first rule: don't get up. I was immediately nauseous. I felt like a bobblehead as my head went one way and my body the other. I collapsed in a pile, trying to find the magic number of blinks to make the world stop spinning. "You'll never get past the safety checks," Harold screamed. "You'll never get the backups. You..." "It's all fingerprinted," Hope sighed. "Fingerprinted, biocoded, voice-checked. Sorry." A man raised his arm. There was no second click. Instead, there was a bang. I looked up with my ears ringing, watching a reflection of my dead self on the other side of the coffee table. Bullet to the brain. Nothing but blank eyes looking back at me. My face didn't look dead. It just looked sort of tired, like I was sleepy. I was expecting that face to blink, but that blink never came. Blood pooled at the corner of the mouth, running down from the open wound at the temple. They pulled me up and dragged me over to Harold's workstation. They used my hand to log in. I had to do a voice recognition check as Hope's associates went through 2 laptops and a smartphone. While they did, Hope sat down across from me. My head was still swimming. "We're gonna need you," she said. "And as long as you play along, you'll be fine. But if you fuck with me," she snapped her fingers twice. Ice filled my veins as I gripped my seat. "I can't imagine something good would happen if we tried this," she said, lowering her voice. "So how about we just really, really pay attention, She explained the plan. They needed Harold alive to slowly transfer his company's shares to someone else without it looking all too suspicious. They needed access to his files, both immediate and over a longer time. They explained that they needed me around to make it appear that everything was fine. In return, I'd get to live in this amazing place, with whatever comforts I could ask for the rest of my days. But if I slipped up, snap, 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 done, fade to black. It was so surreal, watching them wrap up my own body in black plastic, men in tailored blazers scrubbing the floor and walls with bleach, Hope sitting across from me, rubbing her fingers together. "Where do you think you'll go?" she asked. "If I snap my fingers, where do you think you'll go?" I don't know," I stuttered. Maybe you'll be fine," she shrugged. "Maybe there's something nice and warm on the other side. Or maybe the snapping doesn't even work anymore. Wanna try?" No, she smiled. "No, you don't. You're smarter than that. And maybe you're not the gambling type." She tapped the barrel of the gun on Harold's mahogany desk. "You can have all the parties you want. You got a big bank account?" She sighed. "But maybe be careful about inviting musical people. Those who stomp their feet or snap their fingers." And that was that. I was left there. I had keys to the place I didn't know, a phone full of numbers I didn't recognize. I just stood there in the chlorine-smelling house of a stranger. I didn't know what to feel. Ever since I first started step-minding, I had never considered this. It was unreal. I remember looking down at my own hand, not being sure if I could snap myself out of it. What would happen? Over time, I got used to the nausea. Nowadays, it's gone. I can walk around like anyone else, but I have to avoid crowds. I can't risk hearing those 3 snaps. I watch videos with the sound off and subtitles on. I only watch movies after checking the soundtrack, making sure there's no snapping in the songs. Radio is out of the question. You never know where you might hear it. And even if you do, does it work hearing it through a TV? Or in a song? What would risk it? I won't. I can't. I don't think I can ever adjust. I've thought about contacting people from my old life, but I wouldn't know where to begin. How do you explain this? I have to be careful not to draw any attention to myself, or Hope and her cronies might return. And if they do, well, I don't know how far I can push my luck. I mean, I'm comfortable. Harold made close to 6 figures a month on passive income. I've learned most things about his life. He never married, he has no children, and most of his contacts are passing acquaintances at best. He was a lonely man. And now, that's me. I've changed a couple of names in this story, as to make it not too obvious as to who I am. Then again, even if I said it outright, I can't imagine it would matter. No one's going to believe this. How do you convince someone that you're really someone else? It just sounds schizophrenic. I spend most of my days considering my options. I've thought about destroying my hearing as a safety measure. Yes, going deaf is awful, but you have no idea what it's like living with the thought that a sound that can be done at any time by anyone can kill you. It's exhausting, and you end up isolating yourself. So I'm typing this out on a fancy laptop, on a mahogany desk. I'm Harold now, screaming into the void that I used to be someone else. I'm sipping on a drink from a glass with my initials on it, and when I go to bed tonight, I will do the same thing I do every night. I will take a long look at myself. I got better vision now. Harold isn't short-sighted, but I can't look at myself. I'm not there anymore. It's just Harold. Danny was always afraid of the dark, the kind of kid who slept with a nightlight until he was way too old, one who'd never dare step out of his room if the hallway light was off. I remember our first sleepover. When tucked away beneath his covers, he asked me to close the closet door for him. I'd laughed, but still did it. Something about the way the shadows fell in that little dark space was all he'd say. A perfect hiding place for something waiting in the darkness. His fear became something unspoken between us from that day on, really seen as nothing more than a quirk as we grew up. Still, I checked the closet for monsters when he'd ask. After college, we simply drifted apart, our lives taking us where they would. And now, all these years later, the last thing I expected was a call from him, not in the middle of the night, trying to hide the nervousness shaking through his voice. A day later, I found myself knocking at his door, watching the sunset on the horizon, thinking about the last words he'd said to me. "Please, get here before dark." "I'm sorry, Danny." I called in sick at work, picked up a rental car, and spent the day driving through the boonies, navigating mile after mile of country road only to find myself arriving so late. I knocked again, starting to wonder if I'd had the right address. It was a small house, not exactly off the grid, but at the end of a scarcely populated road, surrounded by dense thickets of woodland. Not quite the place I'd expected Danny to land. Somewhere so isolated, but he was always a bit of a recluse. The porch light hummed, seemingly growing brighter as the sunlight waned. Several moths already began buzzing around it, flitting at the glass encasing that protected the light. The deadbolt finally clicked, followed by the door gently opening a few inches, stopped at the chain lock. A thin face peered between the gap, observing me for a second. "You're late." A wide grin plastered across his features as the door closed. More locks unfastened before it swung wide open again. As Danny ran out and hugged me, I couldn't help but smile too. Same old Danny, small and skittish, paranoid as all hell. Maybe a bit more unkempt than I remembered. "What's with the security? Running drugs now?" I said, trying to lighten the air, dancing around the question I knew we were both thinking. Just why the hell was I here? He was vague over the phone. I could hardly even understand the few words he spoke in hushed, fleeting whispers, like he didn't want someone else to hear them. All that somehow fell away seeing my old friend. "Sorry. Had to make sure it was you," he said, gesturing toward the open door. "But where are my manners? Come in, come in. It's getting dark." The way he said that word, dark, I brushed it off and stepped in. He took a second at the threshold, looking out at the road. The tree line around the house had fallen into a murky silhouette against the dim sky, as the streetlight in front of the house flickered to life. As he closed the door, I saw the side was lined with several extra locks, apparently self-installed. One by one, he checked and double-checked them, feeling each to make absolutely sure. The room was stifling, like the late summer heat had been trapped and refused to be let out. There was a staleness in the air. I could almost taste it. Heavy curtains hung over the windows, completely covering each one. Danny turned, seeming to remember I was there. He was always strange, full of little idiosyncrasies, but he'd wear them on his sleeve, and I'd never chosen to judge him. But now, he seemed ashamed. "How about a beer?" he offered, quickly breaking eye contact. At this point, I'd welcome anything to break the awkwardness. He walked to the kitchen, glancing back at the locks one last time. I stepped to the window, pulling the curtain aside to peek out. I already felt a slight desperation for fresh air, And besides, this whole house needed to breathe. Grabbing the frame, I tried to lift it, only for my hands to slam uselessly against it. The damn thing wouldn't budge. Looking down at the windowsill, I noticed a series of small nails haphazardly driven through the wood, pinning it shut. I turned back to see Danny, beer in hand, watching me. "Just checking the view," I said, taking the beer offered, awkwardly scooting away. He pulled the curtain back shut, sealing away the night. "I just prefer to keep them closed." We spent the better part of an hour catching up, recounting the last few years we'd spent apart. At least, I thought it had been about an hour. Time seemed to move at a different pace shut in that little room. I began to relax, partly from the beer, partly from the comfort of realizing Danny really hadn't changed, not on the inside at least. Although, I couldn't help but notice he'd grown more gaunt, with black bags beneath his eyes, like he hadn't slept a night in weeks. A nervous tic permeated from him, revealing itself through small furtive glances at the window and door. Still, I began to feel comfortable, almost forgetting the day before, the call in the night, why I had come here. I stood, going to grab another beer. "You want one?" I asked, heading into the kitchen. He started to say something, nearly standing up, but seemed to reconsider as I stepped out of the room, taking his silence as a no. The kitchen bore the same atmosphere, stuffy air and curtains blocking out the windows. Even the sliding glass door at the back was covered, like the whole house was sealed away from the outside. I opened the fridge, digging past the few containers left, reaching for the last beer in the back, as a smell quickly wafted out towards me. Rotten milk. Holding my nose, I grabbed the carton, feeling the dense curdle swishing around through the liquid. Almost all the food in the fridge was covered in mold. I stood back, holding in a retch as the smell combined with the stifling air of the house. I pulled myself to the sliding door, throwing the curtains aside, trying to open it. A metal bar had been screwed between the door and the wall, jamming it shut. I turned to find Danny standing in the doorway behind me. "Danny?" I asked. "What the hell's going on?" He only looked at the ground sheepishly. "When's the last time you've been out of this house?" "It started maybe a month ago. One night, we sat in the living room as Danny told the story, his legs curled up beneath him on the couch, face blanketed in the light of the lamp. I chose a reclining chair across from him. I still don't know why I woke up that night, just that I did. It was quiet, and I sat in my bed. Something was wrong. Maybe I'd heard a sound or had a nightmare that rattled me. I didn't know. There was just a feeling, like there was something profoundly wrong. I sat there, I don't know how long, too afraid to move. The front yard, that was all I could think about. I could have stayed in bed, pulled the covers up, and just gone back to sleep. I wanted to, and I wish that's what I did. But it nagged at me. The front yard. I should have stayed. But I'm not the same scared little kid you knew. That's what I told myself anyways. So, I got up and went to take a look. I shuffled in my seat, beginning to regret where I had sat. Danny's glasses caught a glimmer of light on the frame as he glanced in my direction, followed by the look of genuine fear that infiltrated his features as his eyes passed over the window, the one right behind me. I came out here and pulled the curtains aside, just enough to peek through. That's where I saw it, across the road, under the streetlight, a silhouette, like a woman, standing there, just staring straight up. She was holding something dangling from her hand. It was round and swinging by a tangle of thin, ropey strands locked in her fingers. Something was dripping from it. I watched it sway as she stood, looking upward, like she was transfixed, staring up towards the light. I had the window cracked open, letting the cool air in. I thought about calling out to see if she was okay, but something wasn't right. The air outside was dead silent. I live in the country. The night's never quite like that. The crickets, the cicadas, they only stop like that when something intrudes. Something that's not supposed to be there. I listened. Even through the glass and heavy curtains, I could hear the cacophony of insects, the sound that had been here ever since I arrived. As my mind filtered it under background noise and let it filter into the background hum of existence. So, I shut my mouth. I leaned over and turned the porch light on, hoping the light would maybe tell her someone was home, or maybe scare her off. I don't know. Honestly, I was a little ashamed, cowering from someone who might need my help, but just something felt wrong. The way it stood there, like it wasn't something human, only wearing a human's form. Maybe it was the way it was still as just a shadow, even standing directly under the light. I know, that sounds ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous as I'm saying it, but I haven't told you about what happened next. I peeked back out the window. Its head was turned, right at me. I couldn't see eyes, but I could feel them watching me. That's when it took a step toward the house. I ducked beneath the window. I held my head down and listened. Footsteps, walking toward the door. Padded feet crunching through the gravel. Oh God, it's coming. I peeked back up, grabbing the curtains to pull them shut, but I stopped. There was no one in the backyard. It should have been there, right in the view of the window. Nothing but the night looked back. Only darkness. Maybe the light had scared it off, I thought. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. A night terror I'd woken into. I didn't know. So I shut the window, sealed the curtains, and waited. No more steps. Nothing. I was just going to go back to my room. Then I remembered the porch light. I thought maybe I'd keep it on for the night at least, just in case. But looking at the door, I could feel my heart sinking. I walked to it and pressed my ear against it. The night was still silent. Good enough. I'm not proud. But I ran back to my room then and covered my head until morning. I wasn't sure what to think. Looking over at my cowering friend, gone was the full-grown man, replaced with the scared child I had grown up with. The beer had begun to sour in my stomach, mixed with the noxious odor of rotting food that lodged in my sinuses. I desperately wanted to open the window. "Danny, I don't know," I said. "I mean, what am I supposed to think of this? You think you saw a person who scared you? Maybe you did have a nightmare. One you convinced yourself was true. You know, like you used to." I could see the look of hurt in his eyes, but I had to rip the band-aid off. He needed help. That much was clear. Maybe it's a mental thing. Like, maybe you should see someone. "That's not why I called you," he said, lowering his gaze. "That was only the first night." I leaned back, letting him speak. I'd figure something out. Some way of getting him out of this house. The thing is, I have a light out in the backyard, for security. It's motion activated. When I'm in my bed and it comes on, I can catch the light just peeking through the top of my curtains. A sliver against the ceiling. Well, it came on the next night, around 3 a.m. Then the night after. Every night, I'll hear it outside. Silence at first. The unnatural stillness that settles over the woods. Then the light. Click. Just once. But the same time every night, I hear it walking out there. Footsteps walking past my bedroom window. I'll wait 20 seconds or so until the lights click off. Then, nothing. Just silence. I checked every morning for some sign. A footprint, broken branches, anything. Not a trace. Then, the next night, it's back. What does it do? I found myself asking. I don't know. It just walks by, circling the house, like it's searching for a way in. And you've seen it again? Or you just think you're hearing it? I am hearing it. And I did see it again. Only a few days later the first night, I woke up again. 3 a.m. A streak of light on the ceiling. Click. It goes off. I sat there again, waiting. I don't know why, but that night, I decided to follow it. I had to see what it was doing. I walked through the house, room by room, window by window, listening. Nothing. Dead silence. I even dared to peek out of the front window toward the streetlight. Nothing. I started to think what you're thinking right now, that this was all in my head. Nyctophobia, the doctors always called it. Fear of the dark. Maybe a screw had finally popped loose. Maybe, I thought. Just maybe. I was going to go back to bed. I walked over to make sure the porch light was on and stopped dead in my tracks. That sinking feeling again. The feeling of something standing at my door. I held my ear to it, listening. Maybe a minute passed. Slowly, I began to hear it. Someone was breathing on the other side. I didn't want to. I knew it was a bad idea, but my curiosity was burning. I looked out through the peephole. It was standing on the porch, inches away, just watching me. I jumped, pushing against the door instinctually. I closed my eyes and ran and locked myself in the bathroom without looking back. The whole night, the light on, cowering behind the shower curtain. When I came out, it was already light. That's when I locked this place up, and I haven't left since. He let his last words hang, waiting for me to say something, maybe looking for assurance, for me to say I believed him. I didn't know what to say. He continued, breaking the silence. And the thing it was carrying, what it had in its hands, I've thought about that a lot. I didn't want to admit this, but I knew what it was as soon as I saw it. I've thought about it over and over, and I know there's nothing else it could be. It was a human head. God damn it, Danny. You've finally gone off the deep end. I'm sorry, I'm just having a hard time believing this, I said, treading tactfully. A human head? Why not call the cops or just leave? Walk out during the day to get to a hotel or something. I thought about that. You've seen how long the drive here is. It'd be the better part of an hour before the cops could arrive. And what am I to tell them? There's a monster outside? No evidence, not even a footprint? No head dripping blood hanging in the woods? Help me. There's a silhouette of a woman at my window? You know how ridiculous that sounds? And I haven't left because, well, his face blushed a bright red. Because I'm scared, all right? I can't leave. I've stood at the door, my hand on the handle telling myself to walk through, but I can't. Because my mind is telling me it's out there, waiting for me. That's why it was walking to the door. It was a trap. I'm sorry. That's why I called you. I didn't know what else to do. I chuckled and immediately felt ashamed of myself. It wasn't from humor, but a reflex, an attempt to ease my discomfort at the situation. I was at a loss for words. For the first time in our relationship of 20-odd years, I felt something close to pity for my friend. We sat in silence, letting the humming crickets outside fill in the gap. Their noise felt comforting in a way. He finally looked back at me, right at me. It got in the house last night. I felt myself swallow. In the hallway. I don't know how. Every door and window is locked shut. You've seen that. But it got in. It was walking through the house, right up to my bedroom door. My mouth felt dry, and I was a little sick to my stomach. A side effect of the beer, I told myself. I didn't believe his story. Not at all. How could I? Danny had always been the one to believe in the boogeyman. Still, I leaned forward, all too aware of the night just on the other side of the window behind me. All right, I said, fighting against my rising heart rate. I'm here now, so what does that mean? Just stay here. For one night, that's all. Tomorrow morning, we'll walk through that door. Please. He wanted me to check the closet for monsters. We ended up pushing the recliner through the hall and into Danny's room. He insisted I stay there with him. The clock had already slipped past midnight when I slumped into the chair, letting the fatigue and exhaustion of the day sink into the cushions with me. I listened to Danny stepping from room to room through the house, checking each window, making sure each curtain was drawn tight. This had the feeling of a nightly ritual. The hallway creaked under his feet as he stepped to the bathroom, stopping for a moment in front of it. I slipped my shoes off and pulled the covers over myself. The air in the bedroom wasn't as bad as the front of the house, although it felt impossible to entirely escape the humid stuffiness that filled the atmosphere. It was going to be a long night. Danny closed the bedroom door, locking it. Just the small lock on the handle. There weren't any of the homemade barricades on it. I guessed he wouldn't have had the time to make a latch, or maybe he'd run out of materials. He retreated to his bed after saying goodnight, leaving the room in the dim glow of a bedside lamp. I realized he had no intention of turning it off. We sat in our respective beds, neither of us sleeping, more waiting for the morning to come. Although the silence wasn't awkward, we'd run out of small talk since his story of monsters. Maybe neither of us knew how to follow that up. I had the feeling both of us were too exhausted either way to even try. I turned over, covering my head with a blanket in an attempt to suffocate the light. Finally, as I was drifting into sleep, he spoke. "Hey, Aaron." "Yeah? Thanks." I laughed, letting the humor slip in this time. "We're having a sleepover." Danny laughed from his bed. "I guess so." The light still seeped through my closed eyes as sleep finally came to me. Through a yawn, the words came out half-formed. "See you in the morning." I woke up not much later, covering my eyes from the light. It took a moment for my surroundings to sink in. I peeked over the blanket at Danny, fast asleep next to the blaring lamp. Shielding my eyes, I reached over and turned it off, darkness filling the room. It immediately soothed the growing throbbing in my head. I closed my eyes again, trying to fall back asleep. It wasn't going to happen. Instead, I sat in the dark room as the minutes ticked by, waiting. Sweat had soaked the blanket around my neck, and the damp humidity clung to my skin. There was a tightness in my chest, like I expected something to happen. I didn't want to sit in that chair, waiting in tense silence, enclosed in that stifling room. I didn't want to be in that house a second longer, resisting the urge to tear through the door and run. Instead, I stood up and stretched, like an animal exploring the bars of its cage, as if the air wouldn't feel so dense if I got up and moved through it. It still did. My stomach churned and grumbled with the movement, reminding me I hadn't had a bite to eat since the drive up, and only a couple beers all night. I headed to the door, quietly turning the lock. "Sorry, Danny. I'll be right back," I half whispered, half thought as I slipped into the hall. The fluorescent light hummed in the bathroom, spilling out over the stretch of hallway leading into the living room. I laughed at myself. Some things never change. I walked through the living room, passing by the door, trying to pretend it wasn't the center of my attention. I didn't believe what Danny had told me, and I wasn't afraid of the dark. Still, my hair raised on end looking at that thin piece of wood, sealed shut against the night, and the rows of homemade locks. Anything could be on the other side, but nothing was going to get in at least. I took a single step onto the cool kitchen tile and stopped. With a sigh, I headed back, curiosity getting the better of me, or maybe just needed to prove there was nothing out there. I placed my ear against the wood, listening. Not a sound. Dead silence. My body tensed, each sinew pulling taut as I leaned toward the peephole, a bundle of nerves ready to jump back at the mere sight of anything. I placed my eye up to the glass as the porch came into view, distorted into an exaggerated fisheye perspective. It was empty. A breath of relief shuddered out of me, a little harder than I intended. The spike in blood pressure wasn't doing anything for my head though, and I scolded myself for getting worked up. I didn't want to admit Danny's story had gotten under my skin, and despite the reassurance of the empty porch, I still felt a pit in my gut, like there was something wrong with what I had looked at. I found a cup and downed a glass of water from the sink, adrift in my thoughts, like something was out of place. The water helped, but still felt empty in my stomach. I thought maybe I could even brave the fridge. I'd seen a jar of pickles in there. They had to be preserved. It wasn't a meal, but it would at least last me the next few hours. Something wasn't supposed to be there. I held my nose and opened the fridge as a blast of light flooded into the room, forcing my eyes to squint. The cooling unit hummed. Letting my eyes adjust, I reached through the old food containers, digging toward the back. My hand stopped. That was it. What was wrong? The entire house had been silent since I'd woken up. There was a loud click in the backyard as light poured through the seams between the curtains, spilling onto the ceiling. A swarm of thoughts flooded through my head, stoked into a manic rush. The door is locked. The entire house is locked. Nothing's going to get in. 3 a.m. How did I know that? My eyes darted through the room, looking for a clock. I must have seen the time somewhere. On the nightstand or the little clock in the living room. I tried to remember, to think back at the hands, picture them at any position, but the number was seared in my head. 3 a.m. Seconds ticked by as I stared through the kitchen, acutely aware of the heartbeat in my ears, a rhythmic, steady pulsing, like footsteps. How long did he say? 20, 30 seconds? I sat at that damn light for an eternity. Turn off, you son of a bitch. I told myself to do something, anything. Open the curtains, look out. There's no such thing as monsters, right? I even thought about yelling for Danny, like a scared child. I forced myself to hold composure against the growing urge to run. There's nothing there, just the wind outside, blowing through the yard, just on the other side of the curtains. I found myself backing up, leaving the fridge open as a putrid air seeped from it. There was a second click as the light finally shut off, leaving only the fridge light illuminating the room. In the space of breath, the curtains began to lift, slowly at first, like a breeze were passing through. The heavy fabric over the door began to push into the room, as if someone were pressing against it from the other side. The silhouette of a head and shoulders began to take shape in the material, pulling the curtain further into the room as it dragged along behind the figure. That door wouldn't open. I knew that. I had felt the damn thing with my own hands. There was no way someone or something could walk into that room, not through a barricaded door. I stepped back more, feeling the carpet beneath my feet as the curtain finally reached its end, pulled taut against the rod. It slid over the person beneath. The kitchen stood empty as it fell back against the glass. No person, no monster, just the humming refrigerator and the unnatural silence of the night. Then a footstep, not an auditory illusion this time, not the house settling, not the rushed sound of my heart pumping through my ears. It was the clear sound of a bare foot against tile, coming right from the empty room, followed by another, closer, then another, like it was walking toward me, all at once, as if crossing a threshold. It appeared directly in front of me, in a single step transforming from pure blackness into a complete humanoid silhouette in the light of the fridge. I stumbled back, falling to the dark ground in the living room. I thought I'd have screamed, or run or done, well, anything. Instead, like a deer in the headlights, I only managed to look up and gape silently like an idiot. Suddenly, I understood why Danny couldn't leave the house. It's easy to imagine what you would do when confronted with the boogeyman. If you didn't believe in it, that quickly changes once you do. In front of me, where there should have been a person, instead stood a human form, cast completely in shadow, the shape of a woman, just under my height, with long tangled hair falling over her shoulders and rickety legs that twitched as she stood. The silhouette took another step toward me, reaching out with a thin, emaciated arm. I looked to the door, and the rows of locks I'd never be able to open in time. Even if I was wrong about anything getting into this house, I sure as hell wasn't going to get out. My legs had turned to mush. I couldn't even run if I tried, much less stand up under my own power. I turned back, ready to face it right in front of me. Instead, it stood at the same spot, turned toward the fridge and staring into it, a single hand reaching toward the light. There was something unnatural in the way the light spilled over it, as if struggling to wrap around the thing's skin, mostly silhouette. I could notice just enough detail to make out its cracked, protruding fingernails, stained with a splattering of deep burgundy. All I heard was my own sharp breathing as it rattled through the empty house. The silhouette focused on the fridge, hand mechanically grasping the air in front of it, like it didn't even know I was there. Maybe it was looking for food, like the smell had somehow lured it in. With its attention focused away from me, I found a sudden welling of courage, enough to hesitantly crawl toward the hallway, moving as silently as I could, transfixed on the fridge. Its body gently swayed as if in a trance, the vague outline of gnarled breast on its chest rising and falling as it breathed. I pulled myself around the corner into the safety of the hallway, Danny's room at the end and the open bathroom in between. Holding the wall, I lifted myself, desperately stepping toward the room when a sudden rattle of jars clinked from the kitchen. I whipped my head back, heart plummeting as I watched the light cut into a quickly disappearing sliver across the living room. It must have bumped into the fridge, swinging the door shut. Darkness enveloped the living room as the fridge sealed shut, followed by another footstep against the tile. The only light in the house now spilled out from the bathroom next to me. I thought about hiding in there, barring the door and waiting for morning, but I hesitated at the threshold. This thing had gotten into the kitchen, and I wasn't so sure the bathroom door would stop it either. Deep down, something else told me that was a bad idea. Something that I knew but couldn't logically tell myself. I couldn't walk into that room. Another step came from the kitchen, growing louder, quicker. Instead, I reached my hand around the door frame and found the light switch against the wall. At the end of the hallway, a depression, the size of a foot, sank into the soft carpet. I pressed the switch, sending the house plummeting into night. Silence. I stood in the pitch black, listening as the floorboard creaked at the end of the hall. Then, nothing. Gently, I began feeling my way toward Danny's room as my ears strained against the space between the walls, listening for even the slightest movement. The soft compression of the carpet beneath bare feet, my own breathing, the skin of my fingertips tracing along the wall. Another arduous step, the cold metal of the doorknob. I turned it. Sliding into the room, I closed the door, holding the knob turned in my shaking hand. As I tried to avoid the loud click as it shut, the drawn-out moaning screech of a hinge reverberated through the room and into the hallway. I stepped back, acutely aware of every creak, rustle, and murmur through the house. I waited for footsteps in the hall, to hear it at the door, the hinge squealing as it groaned back open. Outside, the wind rustled through the woods, slipping through the creaking, moaning trees. My own stifled short breaths, and the deep resonant inhalations from the sleeping Danny. Feeling my way through the room, I brushed a curtain with my hand, letting a thin stream of moonlight fall over the bed, just enough to see by. I scanned over Danny, still fast asleep, then the black corners of the room. It was empty. I found the sofa chair and sank back into it, my legs finally giving out beneath me. I wasn't sure what to do now, other than wait for dawn. Maybe I could get Danny, and we could slip past it into the night. He'd know how to open the locks. Or we could unseal a window and slip out. Or maybe there was some way of fighting it, something we could do to hurt it. I looked at Danny, letting that fantasy slip away. Poor Danny. I thought about the monsters he'd spent his life in fear of, hiding away from. Even if my mind was committed, there was no way my heart, still burning with fresh terror, would let me even stand out of this chair. I might as well cover my head with a blanket and hide until dawn. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you." That's when I heard it. Just feet in front of me, a third set of breathing, shallow struggled breaths. It was in the room with us. I held still, every nerve frozen as I strained my eyes, struggling to make out a silhouette in the draped shadows that hung across the walls. At the door, just feet away from Danny's bed, I began to make out the vague shape. The rustle of sheets came from my side. I turned to see Danny, half awake and leaning up in bed, grabbing his glasses mechanically from the nightstand, sliding them over his ears. I wasn't sure if he could see me in the dark. Looking back at him, all I could do was silently plead, as I watched his expression turn from confusion to a look of abject horror as he became aware of the darkness. I wasn't sure if I said it or screamed the words in my head, but a loud resounding no shook through me. Maybe it was too late, or maybe I just couldn't bring myself to move, or even try to stop him. He turned on the light, frantic. In the space of a blink, everything happened. A single flash of light, half falling from the chair. I grabbed at the cord, yanking it from the wall. In that split second, as the room filled with light, I saw it. The shape of the thing in the room with us, and Danny, staring at it. A scream, the sound of mortal terror, high-pitched and piercing. It was the sound of a scared child confronted by the thing he'd feared his whole life. The monster in the closet standing at the foot of the bed, not afraid of the light, but drawn to it. Blackness covered everything again as the light died. I stumbled from the chair, reeling blindly in the dark, frantic and feral, grabbing, pulling, anywhere away from that bed. I grabbed something, a door. I pulled myself through, pulling it closed behind me. I turned, immediately finding myself against the wall, then another to my side. I was in a small room, windowless and cluttered, no more than a few feet wide. Finding nowhere else to crawl, I curled myself up tightly into a corner. Then I did the only thing I could. I hid. I don't know how much time passed, how many hours or days that slipped by in the darkness. Nothingness and silence. My eyes were firmly shut, blocking out everything. I waited as the footsteps moved through the room one last time. As they stopped, just outside the door I hid behind. I waited even after the thing's breathing was drowned out by the returning insects and birds that filled the morning air with their songs. When I finally opened them, a thin lattice of light, cold and white, slipped through the slatted door next to me, leaving a pattern against the wall. I managed to peek through one of the slats in the door, spaced just far enough apart I could press my eye against it and peek through. Danny's room and the back of the sofa sat in front of me. Everything finally clicked. I was in the closet. I strained, looking out, leaning against the wood as silently as possible. The first rays of morning, barely peeking over the horizon, had slipped through the open curtains, cutting a line through the room, all the way to me. Most everything else was hidden behind the sofa, although I could see about half of the bed and the door. I couldn't see a sign of Danny or the silhouette, just the empty room in front of me. I finally crawled out when I had no other choice, when I was sure night was going to descend again with me hiding in the shadows at the back of that closet. I wasn't going to spend another night in that house. It was already late into the afternoon when I unbarred the door and stepped out onto the sun-drenched terrace. No idea what had happened to Danny, other than he was gone. Although, I wasn't surprised when the months had passed and I'd never received a call from him, a relative, or even the police. He was a recluse after all, more so than I thought, a person who could disappear without a trace. Still, on some nights, I'd wake in the darkness, listening to my wife breathing next to me, and I'd look at the phone, wondering, waiting for it to ring. That was until just last night, when I woke up in my apartment, stillness hanging in the air, when I followed a feeling out into the living room and looked through the window down into the alley below, when a passing car, for the briefest second, illuminated the thin space between buildings, when for that brief second, through my sleep-filled eyes, I saw a shape, the vague silhouette of a person, standing in the dark, holding something small and round in its hands, and the sudden metal glint of glasses that came from it. All I know is that I'm sleeping with the lights off from now on. I exhaled sharply as I lowered the revolver from my temple. Today marks the 5th anniversary of Nadia's disappearance. Hard to believe it's been that long. We had so much time left, so much life to live together, but that all came to a screeching halt half a decade ago, on the day we found those stairs. Without her, I have no purpose. I've got no family, no friends, no one to keep me tethered to this world. So, every year on the night that Nadia went missing, I stumble out to the spot that it happened with my 6-shooter in hand, halfway drowned in a handle of vodka, and I let the forest decide if I'm going to live another year, or if I'm going to be reunited with her, wherever she is. Now that it's determined that I have at least one more trip around the sun, I'll tell you how I ended up here, at rock bottom. I need to get this out while I still have the guts to tell this story. Don't know why though. I'm going to wake up sometime tomorrow afternoon with a massive headache and no recollection of tonight's events. I'd better tell you while I still can. I've lived on the outskirts of Bear Creek National Park for my entire life. Don't bother looking it up. It's a fake name so nobody tries to seek out the evil that lurks here. It's safer that way. As I was saying, I used to live out here in a cabin with my dad. I miss him so freaking much. He passed away 8 years ago, leaving me all alone. Cancer is a bitch. That was before Nadia and I started dating. It's funny how things work. I actually met her at a coffee shop on my way back from visiting my dad's grave. When she approached me and asked if the seat across from me was taken, I was instantly smitten. Her deep blue eyes shimmered like the ocean. Long brown hair cascaded down her shoulders in waves. And that smile. When Nadia smiled, it was as if time stopped, just for a moment, so that the whole world could soak in its breathtaking beauty. We were inseparable after that day. In a month, we were dating. In 9 more, we were living together in my cabin. And in another year, we were set to get married. Had a date and a venue picked out and everything. I was on cloud 9, but that was all torn away from me in an instant. God, I wish I had never taken her out there. I had my first encounter with the stairs when I was 7. Dad had always warned me never to climb them. That wasn't a problem for me though. The stairs gave off a malevolent presence. Like anyone who dared to walk up their steps would be eaten alive from fear alone. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was playing in the woods near the cabin when I saw it. A black winding set of metal stairs that stretched maybe a story. They didn't lead anywhere. They just kind of ended. All the stairs are like that. They vary in size and shape and model. But one thing they all have in common is that they don't lead anywhere. And they're never in the same place twice. They just sort of materialize. No one knows how or why, and truthfully, we don't want to know. Most of us, that is. Nadia wanted to know, and that knowledge cost her everything.
Come on, baby, just a little further. I want to see the sunset.
Nadia whined in protest at my proposal to head back. Nadi, I know you do, but we didn't bring flashlights and our phone batteries aren't worth the crap. I don't know about you, but I don't feel like smacking into trees every few feet on our way home.
Fine, you win. I'll go back this time, but promise me we can come back tomorrow?
She requested, puffing out her lower lip and gazing up at me with her best puppy dog eyes. I'd be lying if I said they hadn't worked. All right, I'll take you back out here tomorrow, but only if you, I trailed off, entranced by the sight of them. Nadia's brows knitted together in confusion as she traced my gaze. Then her jaw fell open. Directly before us stood a polished cedar wood staircase. I got a sinking feeling in my gut the moment I laid my eyes on that thing. It looked so out of place, like a rat in a fish tank.
What is that thing?
Nadia muttered, gaze still fixed on it. It's nothing. I'll tell you later, I said, snatching her hand and leading her in the opposite direction.
Ow, Jason, let go. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? Tell me what's going on or I'm not moving another inch.
Nadia protested, crossing her arms defiantly. I sighed. There was no point in hiding it any longer. She was going to find out eventually. Okay, so this is gonna sound completely unhinged, but please bear with me. Ever since I've lived here, ever since anyone's lived here really, people have been finding random staircases in the forest. They appear and disappear all the time, and you'll never find one in the same place twice. The stairs are a bad omen. Something awful happens if you climb to the top, but no one quite knows what. All I know for certain is we need to stay far, far away from them. Nadia rolled her eyes in response.
Come on, Jay. Do you really expect me to believe that? A bad omen? Are you some kind of spiritual medium now? Ooh, a staircase. So scary.
She said, waving her hands in a mocking gesture. Nadia, do I look like I'm joking? I know it sounds crazy, but I wouldn't lie to you. She softly took my hands into hers and met my gaze.
Baby, you know I wouldn't accuse you of that. It's strange, but if it really irks you that much, I won't press it, okay?
Thank you. Now let's get home. I'm starving. Once we were out of sight of that wretched thing, I could sense the tension starting to disperse. It was as if a veil had been lifted. I fell asleep that night with a stomach full of dumplings and not a thought in the world besides the petite girl snuggled in my arms. The stairs had vanished from my brain, just like they always did, until the next day. We both had the entire day off of work, and before I knew it, Nadia was pulling me back down the same path as the day prior to watch the sunset. Butterflies danced in my stomach as we approached the spot that we'd seen the stairs the day before. Even so, Nadia noticed it first.
Hey, isn't this the same place you pulled me away from yesterday? Those stairs, they're gone.
See? I told you, they're a bad omen. Now do you believe me?
I never said I didn't. It's just a strange phenomena, you know? Like seeing a unicorn. You don't really ever expect to find it, or in this case, not find it. It's a lot to process.
I didn't know what to say. She'd hit the nail on the head with her analysis. Except the staircase were no unicorns. No, they were something far more sinister. We continued our walk in silence until we finally reached our destination. That evening will always stand out in my mind. The sky looked like a painter's canvas. A gorgeous amalgamation of purple and pink and orange melted together behind a smattering of light wispy clouds. I'd never seen anything so picturesque. We stayed there well past the sunset, staring up into a sea of stars illuminating the night sky.
Thank you for keeping your promise. Today was perfect.
Nadia yawned, sleepily resting her head on my shoulder. Every day with you is perfect. Thank you for dragging me out of the house. This really has been incredible. I love you so much.
You're welcome, Bonehead. I love you too.
Nadia giggled quietly, her eyes struggling to stay open. All right, sweetheart. I think it's time for us to go back. You can hardly stay awake.
Just a little longer. You're so comfy.
She protested, burying her face into my chest. My heart felt so full in that moment. What had I done to deserve such an amazing girl? All right, up we go, I said, hoisting my weary girlfriend into my arms. If your legs won't move, I have no choice but to carry you.
Oh no, how terrible. Whatever shall I do?
She quipped, wrapping her arms around my neck. Nothing. Just stay still and let me. I froze mid-stride. I swallowed a dry lump in my throat as sweat began to bead atop my brow. In the darkness among the foliage, my flashlight beam fell upon a large, bulky object. They were back.
Jason, what's wrong? You look pale.
Nadia said, following the ray of light until she realized what I was looking at. A wide set of weathered concrete steps ascended out of nowhere. They called to me, begging me to climb them. Just one step, just one. That's all.
Jason, I feel it now. What you were talking about yesterday, I feel it. It's all wrong. They shouldn't be here.
Nadia whimpered, fear jolting across her pupils. Yeah, you're right, I said, ripping my gaze from the awful thing. Just don't look at it. We're going to be okay. This time, I wasn't as relieved once we'd escaped the staircase's alluring pool. I'd never seen the stairs 2 days straight before. They were always more sporadic in their appearance, never showing up with any rhythm or consistency. So to see them twice made me a bit uneasy. Nadia and I didn't mention the stairs again that evening. We were both absolutely exhausted, and we were itching to get some much-needed rest. I'd be damned if I was going to let a stupid staircase ruin a good night's sleep. Nadia was already snoring when I joined her in bed, and I was out the second my head hit the pillow. If only we could have made it until morning. Maybe then, she'd still be here. I awoke in a pitch-black room. Nadia was missing from her side of the bed. I didn't worry at first. It wasn't abnormal for her to sneak off to the bathroom in the middle of the night every once in a while. I didn't want to drift back off until I had her beside me, though. I waited and waited to no avail. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I finally called out, "Hey babe, are you coming back to bed soon?" I received no response. That was when the panic set in. Nadia would never ignore me like that. I leapt out of bed and beelined it to the bathroom. It was empty. My heart began to pound against my ribcage like a jackhammer. Sirens were blaring in my head, telling me that something was wrong, and I felt helpless to silence them. I turned the whole cabin inside out with no results. Nadia was nowhere to be found. Then, amongst all the chaos, an idea flickered in my head. Why hadn't I thought of it sooner? Nadia's phone was missing from the bedside table, but I could track her location on Find My Friends. I fumbled to unlock my own phone and open the app. I had to know that she was okay. I loaded up the app and located Nadia's icon. She was close. The app said that she was only a few hundred feet from the cabin. I threw on a pair of shorts and darted out into the frigid night air. I raced, barefoot across the leaves and rocks and acorns. I didn't have time to grab shoes. Right then, I didn't care if my feet were torn to ribbons, as long as Nadia was okay. I eventually reached the point where her phone should have been. I frantically called it, praying that she would pick up this time. I saw something illuminate amongst the leaves, and not far behind it, I found who I was searching for. But instead of being overcome with joy upon finding the love of my life, my blood turned to ice. Nadia's face was partially illuminated by the moonlight trickling through the canopy. She was gazing down at me with tears streaming down her cheeks. Below her feet sat a staircase. This time, it was ornate. White glossy marble stairs gleamed even in the darkness, topped off with a pristine red carpet. The stairs looked as if they led straight to heaven itself, and that terrified me. Dread crashed over me like a tidal wave as we stared at each other. I wanted to move. I wanted to sprint to her and sweep her off those godforsaken things. But I couldn't. I was rooted in place, forced to watch as the girl of my dreams ascended the final step.
Jason, please. I don't want to go. I love you. I want to stay with you forever. I had to know. I could feel them calling to me. Please, don't let them take me.
Nadia sobbed uncontrollably, reaching out a hand toward me. I wanted to grab it, to pull her off into my arms, to tell her that everything was going to be okay, but I was stuck. I was forced to watch in abject horror as Nadia involuntarily took that last step to the top. It felt as if time had slowed to a crawl. 1 second, I was paralyzed, eyes locked on Nadia and those vile stares, and the next, I was all alone. Nadia and the staircase had vanished, whisked into the cold night air like they'd never existed at all. The burden of that night will stay with me until the day I die. I wailed. I screamed. I pounded the earth until my fists were bloody and my throat was hoarse. Nadia had been taken away from me, right before my very eyes, and I did absolutely nothing. I blamed myself for a long time after that. Hell, I still do. I don't think I'll ever be able to move on. That's my punishment, I suppose. Living out a dull, meaningless life, while images of my lost girlfriend run through my head, day in and day out. It's why I drink. Strangely enough, I've never seen the stairs again. They're really the only reason that I'm still here. Because maybe if I just give in, maybe if I convince myself to climb that one last looming step, then there might be a chance that I'll be reunited with Nadia. And for me, that's a chance that I have to take. Six victims in a span of 8 weeks, and not a goddamn finger lifted. The state's prosecutor refused to provide a warrant. The police lacked sufficient evidence. Our state rep stood by the assessment made by health officials. The hospital where I used to work called it a series of unrelated health incidences, and every step of the way were pharmaceutical companies with hands far down our pockets. The hatchet men. Go figure. On paper, it just looked like a complaint, like not having enough fancy soaps in the bathroom. But it's hard to convey the sickening feeling of dread that creeps up on you when you see another victim dead on the operating table, their organs ruptured by hundreds of porcelain white teeth. Spontaneous internalized hypodontia, fancy name for teeth growing inside the body, molars blocking airways, canines rupturing stomach linings, blood clots, several arteries. There was no end to the possible complications, and no one said a thing. I put in my 2 weeks' notice and set off on my own. There'd been an outbreak of cases up in Manitoba some years back, but I'd never seen anything like it in the Midwest. Now there was a cluster of victims in the wider Mankato area, smack dab in the south of Minnesota. I talked to 3 of the families. The victims didn't have much in common, and there was no apparent pattern. It wasn't until the 4th family that I realized what was going on. I was allowed to check out the room of a young woman who'd passed away. When I found that she had a love for nature snacks, trail mix and raisins mostly, but also something locally produced, honey roasted sunflower seeds, something she'd bought from a traveling salesman, produced right here in Tomskog, Minnesota, not sold anywhere else. After 2 weeks of living out of my car, I'd once again been on the phone with the police. They knew me by name, but they were no more helpful now than they'd been the first dozen times. There wasn't anything illegal about selling roasted sunflower seeds as a side business, and they had no reason to suspect foul play. Sunflower seeds don't cause people's stomachs to fill with teeth and cut themselves to death from the inside. I couldn't argue with that, but god damn it, I tried. It took a bit more sleuthing, but I made steady progress. I could barely believe my eyes when I found it. The place had the weirdest name. I thought it was a joke at first, but the high house is most definitely a thing. High is actually the word for tooth in the Lakota language, because of course it was. There was a large field where they would grow sunflower seeds at the far end of the property, and with a name like that, I knew I was onto something, and if no one else was going to do anything about it, I'd take matters into my own hands. I refused to see another victim coughing up teeth. The high house used to be a ranch. It was repurposed back in the 90s into sort of a retreat, but the surrounding community slowly got depopulated. Nowadays, only the high house remains. Until I started looking into it, most people just assumed it was abandoned. Getting to it wasn't as simple as one might think. There are several unmarked roads that lead all the way into this sort of circling pattern. If you don't know what to intentionally look for, most people would just drive straight back to the highway. It took me the better part of half an hour to get to the outskirts of the property, even though I knew the roads fairly well. The entire road was protected by an 8-foot-tall chain-linked fence, lined with barbed wire and warning signs. There was no doubt that intruders would, most certainly, be shot on sight, but under the cover of darkness, I still found a way inside. There are spots where animals have crawled under the fence along the sides. It was cold outside, Minnesota weather in late September. A piercing wind cut through my jacket, and my hands were losing their color. There'd been a mild rain earlier, leaving everything damp and chilly. I had to stop myself from slipping on fallen leaves. I'd brought a flashlight, handgun, and a phone. No identification. The clouds parted as I got closer, lighting up the central area of the property with pale moonlight. The house itself was a 70s-style wooden house. At least 15 rooms, spread across 2 floors, 2 entryways, a main one in the front, and a back door leading to a field, a tool shed on the eastern side, and a long series of guest rooms separated from the main building. I think it used to be some kind of stables. The place was falling apart. The grass grew tall enough for me to hide in, and the road leading up to the gate was so cracked that it looked like cobblestone. The windows were boarded up, and there was no sign of any vehicle. I was having second thoughts about this place, but everything pointed me here. Still, I couldn't see much of a business. This was hardly the place for a large-scale operation. It wasn't until I rounded the side of the house that I realized I was on the right track. Right there, poking out of the soil, was a perfectly white molar tooth. Not a big one, but definitely not a pebble. No blood, no bones poking out of the ground, just a tooth. I decided I'd go around the house to check it out from all angles. There were also the guest rooms. Someone could be staying here. I wanted to confirm sunflowers growing in the fields, maybe take a few samples. The thought struck me that maybe this was all unintentional. Maybe they didn't know what happened to their customers. It might be some kind of radiated soil or parasite, but if your customers start to die, then maybe you ought to pay more attention. But that tooth, sticking out of the ground, told me another story. It told me that they knew what they were doing. As I rounded the back of the building, the clouds grew thicker. For a moment, I could barely see anything but the outlines of the property, the sharp corners of the various houses and sheds, along with an abandoned tractor broken down in a dried mud pit. I was so focused on the main building that it took me a few seconds to realize the grass feeling different against my cold fingers. I was standing in the middle of the field. It was covered in sunflowers, mixed in with tall grass, unkempt and untreated. They had a rough texture to them, and just touching them made seeds rattle to the ground, falling haplessly out of the floret. They were ready to harvest. I brought out my phone and started taking pictures. I forgot to take the flash off, so my phone lit the field up like a lightning strike. This was the first time that I saw that. The sunflowers were a sickly blue. I grabbed one of the sunflowers and twisted the head off. I put it in a plastic bag and stuffed it into my pocket. I was about to move on when I suddenly heard a strange rustling noise. The stem of the flower I just cut was shaking back and forth. Seconds later, another sunflower was shaking, then 3 more. As heartbeats passed, they all started shaking in unison. I couldn't help but feel that they were screaming. An alarm, a warning, a thought occurred. If this was an alarm, it meant someone was listening. An alarm means nothing if there's no guard. I backed away from the field and listened. The shaking was hypnotic, going back and forth, all in sync. There was no question about it. It was deliberate. Some kind of instinct or intelligence. They weren't mindlessly swaying in the wind. This was a pattern. I didn't want to overstay my welcome. There was no reason to stick around. I wasn't there to handcuff someone and put them in the back of my car. I just wanted a solid lead. The picture I took turned out fine, so I sent it to a friend of mine and told them I'd call later, just in case I lost coverage. That way, the picture would be out there, no matter what. Good thing I did. As the wind picked up, I smelled an awful acidic smell, like raw oil mixed with sulfur. There was no apparent source, but I could hear something just outside of the fence. A patrol. Something moving in the underbrush, coming out of the forest. A low groan echoing from one point to another, spreading like wildfire. Flock calls. At first, I thought there were 3 of them, but in seconds, there were 8, a dozen, 15, maybe more. Groan after groan after groan. Guttural rumbling calling out to one another. The sunflower field still shook. I had to get out of there, fast. Crawling on my hands through the high grass, I could hear their groans rising and falling. I scratched my hands on little white teeth growing out of the ground. I knocked a few out by the root, and I swear the earth twitched like it hurt. I reached the main building. There was about 4 feet of gravel lining the edge of the foundation, so I didn't have to crawl through the grass. It barely made any noise over the wind anyway. They were by the front gate, 3 of them, congregating. I could only see their vague outlines in the dark. They were tall and had these ridiculously long arms, almost long enough for their knuckles to scrape against the ground. They kept making these strange humming noises, like someone trying to speak with their mouth closed. They'd find me out here, without a doubt. I had to hide and wait them out. I considered going back, but I heard something by the corner of the back of the house. Maybe they'd picked up my tracks, or my scent. If I kept going forward, I'd get spotted by the 3 at the front. I could try to get over the fence, but the barbed wire wouldn't make it easy. Besides, there were plenty of them out in the woods. However, there was a slim window leading into the basement right beside me. I could hide down there until morning and slip out once they stopped looking for me. It was my best bet. All it took was a little push for the rotten frame to come loose. I moved it out of the way and slipped inside. I picked up my phone to use a flashlight, only to see I just had over 30% battery left. I must have forgotten to charge it in the car. The floor and walls were solid concrete. There'd been an attempt to cover it up with wallpaper at some point, but it had loosened and rolled up years ago. Left was this chunky yellow texture, still sticky to the touch. Something crunched under my feet. Looking down, I saw teeth, hundreds of them, various sizes and shapes. Milk teeth, molars, canines. Some whole, some broken, some rotten, some with moving exposed nerves. With every step I took, I could hear something snapping under my heel. I could see them growing by the base of the walls, sprouting like mushrooms. There was a big cluster in one of the corners, with one tooth the size of a thumb. A handful of them grew out of an old rotating fan in the ceiling, the weight tipping it to one side. This made staying quiet almost impossible. I looked around for a hiding spot. There was what looked like an old locker, like something from a gym. At least it was metal, and I could close the door behind me. I took a few steps forward, holding my breath, listening for something to react. At any point I expected to hear something. A shriek, a voice, a scream. To feel a hand on my neck, a whisper in my ear. But I reached the locker. I had to pull on the door a few times. As teeth loosened and fell off the door, the inside was completely covered in teeth, gathering like a hive of insects trying to stay out of the light. There was this moist smell, like a damp mouth. I just stood there, contemplating what the hell I'd stumbled into. Something moved by the stairs. I shut my phone off and stepped inside. Teeth or not, there was plenty of space. I carefully closed the door and curled up into a ball. I felt like I'd crawled into the mouth of a sleeping animal, ready to chomp down and tear me to pieces. I pulled my shirt up to breathe through the fabric, both to stay calm, but also to keep from breathing in too much. This place had to be full of bacteria and mold. My pulse was out of control, and there was something moving outside, something carefully stepping around the teeth, occasionally breaking one off with a bone-chilling snap. It was stumbling, bumping into furniture, sudden rattling as piles of teeth spilled across the floor, a hulking, drooling sniffle, like a kid trying not to cry. It moaned. Husks of words. A threat. I clutched my handgun tight. I'd taken the safety off 100 times at the shooting range, but this was the first time I'd even think about doing it. If that thing came near me, I'd give it all I got. I closed my eyes, trying to hear something over my hammering heart. Heavy, crunching steps, little things falling off shelves, a chair tipping over, and shuffling steps trying to recover their balance. There was a sudden quiet. My fingers were tingling as my body screamed for air. I couldn't keep it in anymore and gasped. The locker door burst open. I think it was a man once. Even in the dim light of the basement, I could see his mouth was so wide it almost split his head in two, teeth covering his entire mouth and tongue, one tooth sticking out of his eye, making him unable to blink, small teeth poking out of his hair and eyebrows, a long canine blocking one of his nostrils. A hand gripped my shirt, little teeth tearing at the fabric. I was lifted out and pushed. I fell against an old sofa, breaking the armrest. I held my head up and took aim. Pulling the trigger would mean my time was up. They'd all hear me and come running. But if it was a matter of that, or dying, I wasn't taking any chances. I didn't even know if a bullet could pierce him. The moonlight reflected off hundreds of little white spots. As it stepped forward and reached out to me, I raised my weapon, and as he moaned, I fired. I fired 3 shots, and the thing just stopped. Blood started running out of the side of its throat. A line of teeth was missing from the mouth, and there was a large hole in its neck. The 3rd shot went wide. It keeled over, still reaching for me. Its hand unfurled, revealing a pristine set of keys. This had been a person. I picked up the keys as blood kept pumping out. The thing on the ground kept twitching, little teeth losing their grip on it as the body died, falling off of him like wilting petals. This had been a person. The thought was alien to me, but I couldn't let it stop me. Not now. I had to go. Something blocked the basement window. A shadow. They were here. I burst into a sprint. I ran through the basement, up the stairs, and through a door. An old dining room with thousands of teeth glittering like little white diamonds. A smell that could only be described as dead bacteria and death. Dozens of canvas sacks, full to the brim with sunflower seeds, ready to be shipped off for preparation. I ran straight for the front door, but turned on a heel. The handle was turning from the outside. I could hear glass breaking, groaning voices, as tall beings climbed inside. There was only one way to go, up. Up a flight of stairs and into a long corridor. Lamps covered in teeth, door handles, little bumps under the carpet, frames, photos, knickknacks, all drowned in white spots and sharp edges. And the darker the hallway got, the bigger they were. I didn't look behind me. I didn't need to. They were coming up the stairs. Some of them were tall enough to climb in through the second-story windows. They were surrounding me. Fast. There was a lining in the ceiling. A pull-down staircase. I pulled it with all my strength, breaking part of the ceiling as dozens of teeth rained over me. I climbed the brittle wooden staircase and coughed as pounds of dust fogged up the air. I rushed up, pulled the stairs up, and looked around. A single window leading out to the fields. A small round window with a cross. That was all I had. I went for it. I heard them pull the staircase back down. I heard them climb it, clearing it in 2 steps. I heard their groans, and I heard them coming closer. My lungs were burning, but I had to keep going. Even if I had to jump through the windows, I couldn't stop. Then I started coughing. My lungs hurt. I lost control of my leg, fell, slid over the floor, and piled teeth in front of me. I barely noticed my bleeding arms. I looked back. I'd been right the first time I saw them. They were just these shades, solid black voids, at least 8 feet tall, hunched over, with long arms that dragged across the floor. It was as if they weren't even truly solid, as they seemed not to break anything in their stride. One of them pointed at me with an elongated finger. It groaned. I spit up a tooth. I could feel them inside my left knee, preventing me from bending the leg. I felt them breaking through the roof of my mouth, the inside of my throat. I tasted blood, and suddenly, there was a blur in my eye. I managed to get back up on my right leg and stumble forward, mere feet away from the window. Outside, the field of blue looked sort of peaceful, but the window railing, the cross, it was solid metal. I grabbed it with my hands, but it was useless. I tried breaking the glass, but a spike of pain in my arm took all my momentum. My hands clinked against the glass. As tips of teeth broke through the skin of my fingers, they were moving closer. They were breaking me apart. All it took was a malicious will, and the world would find a way to appease them. They were killing me. I can't describe the pain. Every pore of my skin stretching, a million little stabs, inside and out, my vision narrowing to a tiny pinpoint, solely focused on the outstretched finger. Then, a grunt. It was different from the others. The hand pointing at me lowered. As the creatures gathered, one of them reverently carried the creature I'd shot in the basement. There was a moment of silence, where all I could hear was myself. I picked up my phone. It took me 2 tries to unlock, and I scraped the screen violently. I called a random number on my contact list and dropped it. I tried saying something, not knowing if they even answered. I tried to ask for help, to ask for someone to come here, but what came out was just this eerie sound. The creatures turned their attention to me. In that moment, I understood. They weren't completely physical and needed someone to fill the sacks. They needed a farmhand, someone to toil in the field, someone to get their seeds out in the world. And if I didn't comply, they can make everything so much worse. I knew it. I saw it. I don't know if anyone heard me. Maybe no one did. Maybe no one will come looking for me. And maybe that picture I sent will be deleted. But a part of me hopes that if someone comes here, some way, someday, that they don't make the mistake I did. I'll hold the keys tight. I hope that they'll listen and help. I think we're lost. I edged the car along, looking for Rosebud Lane. But all I saw were rows and rows of the same cookie-cutter suburban house, crammed in next to each other, going on forever. Sighing, I pulled over at the curb. Can you check the GPS? Sure. As he pulled out his phone, I stared out the windshield. Even though it was a sunny, beautiful day, the neighborhood was a ghost town. Nobody walking their dogs on the sidewalk, no kids playing in the street. I glanced around at the houses, and though it was hard to tell from the reflections on the windows, it looked like the curtains were drawn. Dave sighed next to me. I don't think this is right. What do you mean? He handed me the phone. The app showed our location, in the middle of the woods. I zoomed out a bit, but no suburbs showed up. Whoa, that's weird. I pulled out my phone, but the same thing happened. Little blue dot in the middle of the woods. The closest road was the 2-lane highway we'd pulled off. Guess this is a really new development. Google Maps was almost always accurate, but if the houses had just been built, maybe the software hadn't caught up yet. They certainly looked very new. Overlapping gables, big windows with no shutters, all neutral colors. The grass perfect, without muddy tracks from dogs or kids. The white siding so crisp and pristine, it almost glowed. The windows shiny as a mirror. I hated that sterile, almost uncanny look of new houses, like they'd just been copied and pasted out of a video game and plopped down in the earth. No personal touches, no wear and tear, no character, just sterile and empty and perfect. Maybe you should call Megan, I said. Dave glanced at the clock. I don't want to interrupt the shower. Yeah, but we're lost, and the GPS isn't working. He sighed. If we don't find it in 10 minutes, I'll call her. That was Dave for you, always thinking of others, which was nice, of course, until it got to these kinds of things. He'd rather waste our time driving around aimlessly than give Megan a quick call for fear of being rude. It was always like that with him. But whatever. They say pick your fights, and this wasn't important enough to go to battle over. I continued crawling down the street, past more and more identical houses, but just as I was thinking, maybe I should force him to call Megan, that this was a fight worth choosing, I saw it. A turn up ahead. I sped towards the intersection, hoping the little green sign said Rosebud Lane. But as we got closer, my stomach dropped. What? What the hell? It was blank. It was just a green rectangle of metal, no text on it whatsoever. Wow, someone fucked up. Dave laughed. They had one job. Do you think I should turn? Wait, let me pull up the GPS. The car idled on the corner as I waited for Dave to pull out his phone. Nah, still in the woods. I guess we should turn on it. Yeah, go ahead. I flicked on my blinker and turned onto the unnamed street. More cookie-cutter houses with curtained windows, all painted a perfectly neutral beige with white trim. Even the front lawns looked identical. 3 shrubs along the porch, and a big hydrangea on the garage end. There were no cars in any driveways either, just like the previous street. I wonder if they're so new, some of them haven't been moved into, just standing empty. For some reason, the thought sent a chill down my spine. How weird would it be to live in this neighborhood, surrounded by empty houses? I'd hate to live here, I muttered. It'd be nice having something brand new though, not having everything break all the time. But every single house looks exactly the same. I shook my head. I bet they have a super strict HOA. Probably. We continued up the road. It seemed like the houses stretched into infinity, disappearing into the light fog. What was it again? Number 52? Yep. I slowed the car, looking for mailboxes so I could check the house numbers. But the houses didn't have mailboxes. I guess they must have one of those communal ones, I thought, like apartments and townhouses have. But the houses didn't have numbers on the front doors or the porches either. So weird. We continued driving, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Identical houses, extending to infinity, like someone had just copy-pasted them on a computer screen. I let out a sigh and stared out at the road, looking for signs of life, individuality, anything. And then, finally, through the gloom and mist, I saw a smudge of color. A stop sign. Oh good, we'll see what street we're on, I said. But as we approached, my stomach twisted. My heart pounded in my chest. There wasn't an intersection, or even a crosswalk. There was no actual reason for cars to stop. Yet, the stop sign was still there, and there was another one on the other side of the road, telling cars in the oncoming direction to stop too. There's no reason for a stop sign to be here. Maybe it's like an accessibility thing? Like, the person who owns that house is blind, so everyone needs to stop here so they don't hit him? Does that kind of thing even exist? I mean, great if it does, but I've never seen that. He shrugged. I think we should turn around. Let's just continue a little bit, Dave replied. In like 5 minutes, if we don't find it, we'll turn around. I don't know why I listened to him. I guess it's because, logically, I knew there wasn't much risk to driving around some weird neighborhood. It wasn't like we were wandering around in the middle of the woods, where we could get lost or die of dehydration or be eaten by a bear. It was 1 p.m. in the afternoon, and we were driving down a suburban road. But the instinctual part of myself, the part that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, that prevented humans from going extinct long ago, it was screaming, "There is something wrong here. Get out. Get out now." I drove forward, glancing in the rearview mirror. The stop sign lingered there, its bright red almost unnatural against the gray gloom of the sky. Over the next few minutes, we didn't get any closer to finding Megan's house. There were no street signs, no mailboxes, no indication of where we were going. Even the car's compass seemed messed up, as it switched from north to west a few times, even though we appeared to be going in a straight line. I finally pulled over to the side of the road and pulled out my phone. "I'm just gonna call Megan," Dave said finally, breaking the silence. "Thank you," I snapped back, unable to keep the annoyance out of my voice. After a moment, Dave shook his head. "Not picking up. Alright, let's just go home." "But we told her we'd be there." I sighed and stared at him. "Okay, so what do you want me to do? We're lost. GPS isn't working and she isn't picking up." He paused, glancing around. "Maybe we should ask somebody." "Who? There's no one here." "Maybe knock on a door?" My eyes widened. "That's weird." "Look, let's just knock on a door and ask. If they don't answer, we'll give up and go home." I puffed out a breath. "Fine." I pulled over to the curb. We got out and started up the driveway. It was no longer bright and sunny. The sky was a uniform overcast gray, and the place was so quiet. No cars passing by, no dogs barking, just our footsteps on the pavement. We walked up to the front door. When I didn't see a doorbell, I raised a fist to knock. Knock, knock, knock. No footsteps or barking from inside. "I don't think anyone's home," I told Dave. "Just wait a second. The address is definitely 52 Rosebud Lane, right? I'm like 99% positive, but I'll check." Dave pulled out his phone and scrolled. "Yep, A minute went by. I knocked one more time. Then I leaned over and peered through one of the windows next to the door. What? The layout of the house was really weird. The staircase was plopped in the middle of the foyer, with empty space on either side. Beyond it, in the kitchen, there was a floor-to-ceiling tower of cabinets, not connected to a counter or anything, just there. There was a painting on the wall of a woman standing on a rainy city street, but her eyes were drawn in upside down. What the hell? I felt like I was looking at an AI-generated image, something made by a machine, trying to replicate what a house was supposed to look like inside, without any understanding of the function of stairs or cabinets or human behavior at all. Look, I said, motioning Dave over, but he didn't share my sense of unease. Instead, he laughed. Wow, whoever designed these houses was an idiot, he whispered. Can we go now? Yeah, okay. We headed back towards the car. As I walked around to the driver's side though, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, the familiar feeling of being watched. I whipped around, but all I saw was the row of beige houses, staring down at me with their dark, shiny windows. We should be there by now. You must have just passed it up, Dave replied. No, we didn't. It was almost 2 p.m. now. My stomach grumbled, my shoulders hurt. I just wanted to be back home, curled up under a blanket, watching YouTube and drinking tea. We only made one turn, but somehow, retracing our steps, we hadn't intersected it yet. We hadn't even passed the weird stop sign. Nothing looked familiar. Although, of course, everything looked familiar, because all the houses were the same house. It must just be up a little further. I just want to be home, I whined. But a few minutes later, we passed something that we definitely didn't see on the way in. A house that was different. It was on the left side of the road. Everything about it was identical to the other houses, except for the porch railing. It was installed upside down, bolted into the underside of the roof, the banister at eye level. What the hell? I asked, slowing down the car. We both stared at the house. No builder or designer would make that kind of mistake, would they? A few houses down, there was another house that was different. This time on the right, 2 of the windows had been connected into one long, 15-foot-tall window that extended from the ground to the roof. What the fuck? Dave whispered. This isn't right, I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, I saw it. Just a few houses ahead of us was a mailbox, the only mailbox I'd seen on the street, and in small gold lettering were the words, 52 Rosebud Lane. Attached to the mailbox was a single pink balloon, fluttering in the wind. No, there's no way. It doesn't make any sense. There were no cars parked on the road, no voices or music coming from inside, no indication that there was a party going on, except for that one balloon. I'm calling Megan. The phone trilled in his ear, and then she picked up. Hey Dave, where are you guys? We're a little lost. We're in this development den. He paused. Do you have a pink balloon on the mailbox? No, she said, confused. It's the blue house on the hill, at the end of the cul-de-sac. Did you turn on Mountain Avenue? It's a little hard to get here. She continued on, but I wasn't listening. I was staring at the house, specifically at the upstairs window, where a figure stood in the darkness, watching us. I started the car and made a U-turn, tires screeching against the pavement. Dave turned to me, eyes wide. Someone's watching us from that house. I stomped on the accelerator, the car rocketing down the suburban road. Slow down, Dave shouted. I glanced down. I was only going 40. We can't. We have to get out of here. You're going to crash, damn it, Slow down. But I did have to slow down, because up ahead, materializing out of the fog, was a stop sign. This time, a crosswalk, and a cluster of school children crossing the road. I stomped on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt. Dave and I jerked forward, the seatbelts locking us into place. My heart pounded in my chest. Then I looked up, and all the muscles in my body froze. It wasn't a group of school children. It was an amalgamation of arms and legs, backpacks and sneakers, tousled hair and ponytails, put together like some nightmarish jigsaw puzzle. No face, no eyes, just things that gave the illusion of a normal group of children crossing the street. I stared at the monstrosity 20 feet in front of us, partially veiled by fog, and then I switched the car into reverse. What the fuck? Call 911, I screamed at Dave. Now! We careened past the upside-down railing, the 15-foot window, the pink balloon. As we sped by, the houses got stranger and stranger. Chimneys leading up to the sky, floating gables, hardwood floors that spilled out onto the grass. They say they can't trace our location, Dave shouted. Then, I don't know. Tell them to go to the highway, Route 140, turn at Glenmont Road, and then make a right at the subdivision. He relayed that to them, but my heart was pounding. If we hadn't been able to retrace our steps, if they couldn't track our location, how would they find us? I slowed down slightly, glancing around the street, looking for something, anything that I could recognize. But all I saw were the windows, the curtains wide open, in every single one, the people staring down at us. Although people was a stretch, everything about them was wrong. Their faces had all the wrong proportions, stretched and misshapen. Their eyes were set upside down. They had far too many hands. People that looked like they had been crafted by some horrible AI, just like the houses they lived in. It's now almost 10 p.m. The sky should be dark, but it isn't. It's the same overcast gray color. We've made so many U-turns, I've lost count, back and forth, but it's never the same. The houses, the people, they're always different, like the world is generating just for us each time we drive down it, popping in and out of existence. The police called us. They tried locating us, again and again, but every time, they failed. They insisted that there were only acres and acres of forest where we described our location. I've used my phone to try and get other help. My parents tried to find us too. Nothing has worked. I only have 10% battery left, so I'm posting this online in the hopes that maybe someone, somewhere, knows how to escape this place. Maybe we'll finally get out. I'm so hungry. I'm so tired. All I want to do is stop the car and lie back in my seat, drift off to sleep. But I'm afraid if I do that, they'll get to us. Not the people in the houses. They're learning. With each hour, they look more human, more like us, and they're getting bolder. I see children standing on front of the lawn, still as statues. Women standing on the sidewalk, with faces that almost pass for human. Men crossing the street in front of us. Whenever we drive by, they all start moving in our direction, like we're magnets, a homing beacon. Dave is driving now so I can post this. Maybe I'll take a short nap. For a brief moment, I won't be trapped anymore. I'll dream of being home, curled up with a cup of tea, watching TV with Dave. I'll escape this place, if only for an hour. I'm signing off now. Hopefully someone out there, somewhere, knows how we can escape. And if not, I'll have my dreams to comfort me for a little while.